that her strange captivity would be difficult, yet she believed that embracing pain as the Aiel did would be the easiest part. After all, she had been beaten severely when she paid her toke to the wise ones for lying, strapped by one after another in turn, so she had experience. But embracing pain did not mean just giving way to it rather than fighting. You had to draw the pain inside of you and welcome it as a part of you. Avienda said you must be able to smile and laugh with joy or sing while the worst of the pain still gripped you. That was not so easy at all. That first morning before dawn in Silviana's study, she did her best while the mistress of novices plied a hard-soled slipper on her bared bottom. She made no effort to stifle her sobs when they came, or later her wordless howls. When her legs wanted to kick, she allowed them to flail until the mistress of novices trapped them under one of hers, awkwardly because of Silviana's skirts, and then she let her toes drum the floor while her head tossed wildly. She tried to draw the pain inside her, to drink it in like breath. Pain was as much a part of life as breathing. That was how the Aiel saw life. But oh, light, it hurt! When she was finally allowed to straighten after what seemed a very long time, she flinched when her shift and dress fell against her flesh. The white wool seemed heavy as lead. She attempted to welcome the scalding heat. It was hard, though, so very hard. Still, it seemed that her sobbing stopped very quickly of its own accord, and her flow of tears dried up rapidly. She did not snivel or writhe. She studied herself in the mirror on the wall with its fading. How many thousands of women had peered into that mirror over the years? Those who were disciplined in this room were always required to study their own reflection afterward and think over why they had been punished. But that was not why she did it. Her face was still red, yet already it looked calm. Despite the painful heat in her bottom, she actually felt calm. Perhaps she should try singing? Perhaps not. Plucking a white linen handkerchief from her sleeve, she carefully dried her cheeks. Silviana studied her with a look of satisfaction before replacing the slipper in the narrow cabinet opposite the mirror. "I think I got your attention from the start, or I'd have gone harder," she said dryly, patting the bun on the back of her head. "I doubt I will see you again soon, in any case. You may like to know that I asked questions as you requested." Melaire had already begun asking. "The woman is Liana Sharif, though the light knows how." Trailing off, shaking her head, she pulled her chair back around behind the writing table and sat. "She was most anxious about you, more so than about herself. You may visit her in your free time, if you have any free time. I'll give instructions. She's in the open cells, and now you had better run if you want anything to eat before your first class." "Thank you," Egwene said, and turned toward the door. Silviana sighed heavily. "No curtsy, child?" Dipping her pen in the silver-mounted ink jar, she began to write in the punishment ledger, a neat, precise hand. "I will see you at midday. It seems you will eat both of your first 2 meals back in the tower, standing." Egwene could have left it there, but in the night, while waiting for the sitters to gather in the hall in Tel Riad, she had decided on the fine line she must walk. She meant to fight, yet she had to do it while appearing to go along, to some extent at least, within the limits she set herself. Refusing every order would mean appearing merely obstinate, and perhaps would get her confined to a cell where she would be useless. But some commands she must not obey if she was to maintain any scrap of dignity, and that she had to do, more than scraps. She could not allow them to deny who she was, however hard they insisted. "The Amerlin seat curtsies to no one," she said calmly, knowing full well the reaction she would get. Silviana's face hardened, and she took up her pen again. "I will see you at the dinner hour as well. I suggest you leave without speaking further, unless you wish to end spending the entire day over my knee." Egwene left without speaking, and without curtsying. A fine line, like a wire suspended over a deep pit, but she had to walk it. To her surprise, Alviarin was pacing up and down in the hall outside, wrapped in her white-fringed shawl and hugging herself, staring at something in the unseen distance. She knew the woman was no longer Elida's keeper, if not why she had been removed so suddenly. Spying in Tel Rhynriod gave only glimpses and snatches. It was an uncertain reflection of the waking world in so many ways. Alviarin must have heard her yowling, but strangely, Egwene felt no shame. She was fighting an odd battle, and in battle you took wounds. The normally icy white did not appear so cool today. In fact, she seemed quite agitated, her lips parted and her eyes hot. Egwene offered her no courtesies, yet Alviarin only gave her a baleful glare before entering Silviana's study. A fine line. A little down the corridor, a pair of Reds stood watching, one round-faced, the other slender, both cool-eyed, with shawls draped along their arms so the long red fringe was displayed prominently. Not the same pair who had been there when she woke, but they were not present by happenstance. They were not precisely guards, and then again they were not precisely not guards either. She did not curtsy to these either. They watched her without expression. Before she had taken more than half a dozen steps along the red and green floor tiles, she heard a woman's pained howling start up behind her, hardly muffled at all by the heavy door to Silviana's study. So Alviarin was taking a penance, and not doing well to be shrieking at the top of her lungs so soon. Unless she also was trying to embrace pain, which seemed unlikely. Egwene wished she knew why Alviarin was undergoing penance, if it was an imposed penance. A general had scouts and eyes and ears to inform him on his enemy. She had only her own eyes and her own ears, and what little she could learn in the unseen world. Any scrap of knowledge might prove useful, though, so she must dig for every one possible. Breakfast or no breakfast, she returned to her tiny room in the novice quarters long enough to wash her face in cool water at the washstand and comb her hair. That comb, which had been in her belt pouch, was among the few personal belongings she retained. In the night, the clothes she had been wearing when captured vanished, replaced by novice white, but the dresses and shifts that hung from pegs on the white wall truly were hers. Stored away when she was raised accepted, they still carried small tags stitched with her name sewn into their hems. The tower was never wasteful. You never knew when a new girl would fit an old set of clothes. But having nothing to wear save novice white did not make her a novice, whatever Elida and the others believed. Not until she was sure that her face was no longer red, and she looked as collected as she felt, did she leave. When you had few weapons, your appearance could be one. The same two Reds were waiting on the railed gallery to shadow her. The dining hall, where novices ate, lay on the lowest level of the tower, to one side of the main kitchen. It was a large, white-walled chamber, plain, though the floor tiles showed all the Ajar colors, and filled with tables, each of which could accommodate 6 or 8 women on small benches. 100 or more white-clad women were sitting at those tables, chattering away over breakfast. Elida must be very set up over their number. The tower had not held so many novices in years. Doubtless even news of the tower breaking had been enough to put the thought of going to Tar Valon into some heads. Egwene was not impressed. These women filled barely half the dining hall, if that, and there was another like it 1 floor up, closed now for centuries. Once she gained the tower, that second kitchen would be opened again, and the novices still would need to eat by shifts. Something unknown since well before the Trolloc Wars. Nicola caught sight of her as soon as she walked in. The woman appeared to have been watching for her, and nudged the novices to either side. Silence slid across the tables in a wave, and every head turned as Egwene glided down the central aisle. She looked neither to left nor right. Halfway to the kitchen door, a short, slim novice with long, dark hair suddenly stuck out a foot and tripped her. Catching her balance just short of falling on her face, she turned coolly. Another skirmish. The young woman had the pale look of a Cairhienin. This close, Egwene could be sure that she would be tested for accepted unless she had other failings. But the tower was good at rooting out such things. "What is your name?" she said. "Alvis Tear," the young woman replied, her accent confirming her face. Why do you want to know? So you can carry tales to Silviana? It will do you no good. Everyone will say they saw nothing. A pity that, Alvis dear. You want to become Aes Sedai and give up the ability to lie, yet you want others to lie for you. Do you see any inconsistency in that? Alvestir's face reddened. Who are you to lecture me? I am the Amerlin seat. A prisoner, but still the Amerlin seat. Alvestir's big eyes widened, and whispers buzzed through the room as Egwene walked on to the kitchen. They had not believed she would still claim the title while garbed in white and sleeping among them. As well to disabuse them of that notion so quickly. The kitchen was a large, high-ceilinged room with gray-tiled floors, where the roasting spits in the long stone fireplace were still, but the iron stoves and ovens radiated enough heat that she would have begun perspiring immediately had she not known how to ignore it. She had labored in this kitchen often enough, and it seemed certain she would again. Dining halls surrounded it on 3 sides, for the accepted and for Aes Sedai as well as novices. Laris, the mistress of the kitchens, was waddling about, sweaty-faced, in a spotless white apron that could have made 3 novice dresses, waving her long wooden spoon like a scepter as she directed cooks and undercooks and scullions who scurried for her as fast as they would have for any queen, perhaps faster. A queen would be unlikely to give anyone a smack with her scepter for moving too slowly. A great deal of the food seemed to be going on to trays, sometimes worked silver, sometimes carved wood, and perhaps gilded, that women carried away through the door to the sisters' main dining hall. Not kitchen-serving women with the white flame of Tar Valon on their bosoms, but dignified women in well-cut woolens with an occasional touch of embroidery, sisters' personal servants, who would make the long climb back to the Ajah quarters. Any Aes Sedai could eat in her own rooms if she wished, though it meant channeling to warm the food again. Yet most enjoyed company at meals. At least they had. That steady stream of women carrying out cloth-covered trays was a confirmation that the White Tower was spider-webbed with cracks. She should have felt pleasure at that. Elida stood on a platform that was ready to crumble beneath her. But the tower was home. All she felt was sadness, and anger at Elida, too. That one deserved to be pulled down simply for what she had done to the tower since gaining the stolen staff. Laris gave her one long look, drawing in her chin until she had a 4th, then returned to brandishing her spoon and looking over an undercook's shoulder. The woman had helped Swan and Lyanna escape once, so her loyalties to Elida were weak. Would she help another now? She was certainly making every effort to avoid looking in Egwene's direction again. Another undercook who likely did not know nothing about Lyanna. A smiling woman still working on her second chin, handling a wooden tray with a large, stout cup of tea and a thick, white glazed plate of bread, olives, and crumbly white cheese that she carried back into the dining hall. Silence fell again, and once more every eye centered on her. Of course. They knew she had been summoned to the Mistress of Novices. They were waiting to see whether she was standing. She wanted very much to ease herself onto the hard wooden bench, but she made herself sit down normally, which reignited the flames, of course. Not as strongly as before, but strong enough to make her shift before she could stop herself. Strangely, she felt no real desire to grimace or squirm. To stand, not the other. The pain was part of her. She accepted it without struggle. She tried to welcome it, yet that still seemed beyond her. She tore a piece of bread. There were weevils in the flour here, too, it appeared. And slowly the conversation in the room started up again, quietly because novices were expected not to make too much noise. At her table also the talk resumed, though no one made any effort to include her. That was just as well. She was not here to make friends among the novices, nor to have them see her as one of themselves. No, her purpose was far different. Leaving the hall with the novices after returning her tray to the kitchen, she found another pair of Reds waiting for her. One was Katarina Al-Ruddin, vulpine in copiously red-slashed gray, a mass of raven hair falling in waves to her waist, and her shawl looped over her elbows. "Drink this," Katerina said imperiously, extending a pewter cup in one slim hand. "All of it, mind." The other read, dark and square-faced, adjusted her shawl impatiently and grimaced. Apparently she disliked acting as a serving woman even by association, or perhaps it was dislike for what was in the cup. Suppressing a sigh, Egwene drank. The weak forkroot tea looked and tasted like water tinged a faint brown, with just a hint of mint. Almost a memory of mint, rather than the taste itself. Her first cup had been soon after waking, the Red Sisters on duty eager to be done with shielding and about their own business. Katerina had let the hours slip a little, yet even without this cup, she doubted she would have been able to channel very strongly for some time yet. Certainly not with enough strength to be useful. "I don't want to be late for my first class," she said, handing the cup back. Katerina took it, though she seemed surprised to realize that she had. Egwene glided on after the novices before the sister could object, or remember to call her down for failing to curtsy. That first class, in a plain windowless room where 10 novices occupied benches for 30 or more, was every bit the disaster she expected. Not a disaster for her, however, no matter the outcome. The instructor was Idrella Menford, a lanky, hard-eyed woman who had already been accepted when Egwene first came to the tower. She still wore the white dress with the 7 bands of color at hem and cuffs. Egwene took a seat at the end of a bench, once again without consideration for her tenderness. That had lessened, though not very far. Drink in the pain. Standing on a small dais at the front of the room, Idrella looked down her long nose with more than a spark of satisfaction at seeing Egwene in white once more. It almost softened her frown, a fixture with Idrella. "You have all gone beyond making simple balls of fire," she told the class. "But let's see what our new girl is capable of. She used to think a great deal of herself, you know." Several of the novices tittered. "Make a ball of fire, Egwene. Go on, child." A ball of fire? That was one of the earliest things novices learned. What was she about? Opening herself to the source, Egwene embraced saidar, let it rush into her. The forkroot allowed only a trickle, a thread where she was accustomed to torrents, yet it was the power. And trickle or no, it brought all of the life and joy of saidar, all the heightened awareness of herself and the room around her. Awareness of herself meant her smarting bottom suddenly felt freshly slippered again, but she did not shift. Breathe in the pain. She could smell the faint aroma of soap from the novice's morning wash, see a tiny vein pulsing on Idrella's forehead. Part of her wanted to clout the woman's ear with a flow of air, but given the amount of power she commanded now, Idrella would barely feel it. Instead, she channeled fire and air to produce a small ball of green fire that floated in front of her. A pale, pitiful thing it was, actually transparent. "Very good," Idrella said sarcastically. Ah, yes. She had just wanted to begin by showing the novices how weak Egwene's channeling was. "Release, saidar. Now, class." Egwene added a blue ball, then a brown, and a gray, making them spin around each other. "Release the source," Idrella said. A yellow ball joined the others, a white, and finally a red ball. Quickly, she added rings of fire, one inside the other, around the whirling balls. Red came first this time because she wanted it smallest, green last and largest. Had she been able to choose an Aja, it would have been the green. 7 rings of fire rotated, no 2 in the same direction, around 7 balls of fire that carried out an intricate dance at the heart. Pale and thin they might be, yet it was an impressive display beyond dividing her flows 14 ways. Juggling with the power was not all that much easier than juggling with your hands. "Stop that!" Idrella shouted. "Stop it!" The glow of saidar enveloped the teacher, and a switch of air struck Egwene hard across the back. "I said stop it!" The switch struck again, then again. Egwene calmly kept the rings spinning, the balls dancing. After Sylviana's hard-swung slipper, it was easy to drink in the pain of Idrella's blows, if not to welcome it. Would she ever be able to smile while she was being beaten? Katarina and the other Red sat in the doorway. "What is going on in here?" the raven-haired sister demanded. Her companion's eyes widened when she saw what Egwene was doing. It was very unlikely that either of them could divide their flows so far. The novices all popped to their feet and curtsied when the Aes Sedai entered, of course. Egwene remained seated. Idrella spread her banded skirts, looking flustered. "She won't stop," she wailed. "I told her to, but she won't." "Stop that, Egwene," Katarina ordered firmly. Egwene maintained her weaves until the woman opened her mouth again. Only then did she release Saidar and stand. Katarina's mouth snapped shut, and she took a deep breath. Her face retained its Aes Sedai serenity, but her eyes glittered. "You will run to Sylviana's study and tell her that you disobeyed your instructor and disrupted a class." Pausing long enough to straighten her skirts, when she obeyed, she must not do so with any appearance of eagerness or haste. Egwene squeezed past the two Aes Sedai and glided up the hallway. "I told you to run," Katarina said sharply behind her. A flow of air struck her still sensitive bottom. Accept the pain. Another blow. Drink in the pain like breath. A third, hard enough to stagger her. Welcome the pain. "Unhand me, Jezreel," Katarina snarled. "I'll do no such thing," the other sisters said with a strong Tyrant accent. "You go too far, Katarina. A swat or two is permitted, but punishing her further belongs to the Mistress of Novices. Light at this rate you'll leave her unable to walk before she reaches Sylviana." Katarina breathed heavily. "Very well," she said at last. "But she can add disobeying a sister to her list of offenses. I will inquire, Egwene, so don't think you can let it slip your mind." When she stepped into the Mistress of Novices' study, Sylviana's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Again so soon? Fetch the slipper from the cabinet, child, and tell me what you've done now." After 2 more classes and 2 more visits to Sylviana's study, she refused to be made mock of, and if an accepted did not want her doing a thing better than the accepted herself could, the woman did not ask her to do it at all. Plus her foreordained midday appointment between, the stern-faced woman decided that she was to have healing to begin each day. "Else you'll soon be too bruised to spank without bringing blood. But don't think this means I'm going easy on you. If you require healing 3 times a day, I'll just spank all the harder to make up. If need be, I'll go to the strap or the switch. Because I will make your head straight, child. Believe me on that." Those 3 classes, leaving 3 very embarrassed accepted, had another result. Her teaching was shifted to sessions alone with Aes Sedai, something normally reserved for accepted. That meant climbing the long, tapestry-lined, spiraling corridors to the Aja quarters, where sisters stood at the entrances like guards. They were guards, in truth. Visitors from other Ajas were unwelcome, to say the least. In fact, she never saw any Aes Sedai near the quarters of another Aja. Except for sitters, she seldom saw sisters in the hallways outside the quarters other than in groups, always wearing their shawls, usually with warders following close behind. But this was not like the fear that gripped the encampment outside the walls. Here it was always sisters of the same Aja together, and when 2 groups passed, they cut each other dead if they did not glare. In the worst of summer, the tower remained cool, yet the air seemed feverish and gelid when sisters of different Ajas came too close. Even the sitters she recognized walked quickly. The few who realized who she was gave her a long, studying look, but most appeared distracted. Pavara Tazanovny, a plumply pretty sitter for the Red, almost walked into her one day. She was not going to jump aside, even for sitters, but Pavara hurried on as if she had not noticed. Another time, Dosine Alwayn, boyishly slim if elegantly dressed, did the same while deep in conversation with another yellow sister. Neither glanced at her twice. She wished she had some idea who the other yellow was. She knew the names of the 10 ferrets Shiriam and the others had sent into the tower to try undermining Elida, and she very much would have liked to make contact with them, but she did not know their faces, and asking after them would only draw attention to them. She hoped one of them would pull her aside or hand her a note, but none did. Her battle would have to be fought alone except for Lyanna, unless she overheard something that put faces to some of those names. She did not neglect Lyanna, of course. Her second night back in the tower, she went down to the open cells after supper despite her bone-deep weariness. Those half-dozen rooms in the first basement were where women who could channel were held, if not to be closely confined. Each held a large cage of iron latticework that ran from stone floor to stone ceiling, with a space around it 4 paces wide and iron stand lamps to provide light. At Lyanna's cell, 2 Browns were sitting on benches against the wall with a warder, a wide-shouldered man with a beautiful face and touches of white at his temples. He looked up when Egwene walked in, then returned to honing his dagger on a stone. One of the Browns was Falana Bevane, slender with long yellow hair that gleamed as if she brushed it several times a day. She stopped writing in a leather-bound notebook on a lap desk long enough to say in a raspy voice, "Oh, it's you, is it? Well, Silviana said you can visit, child, but don't give her anything without showing it to Delevian or me, and don't make any fuss." She promptly returned to her writing. Delevian, a stocky woman with gray streaking her short dark hair, never looked up from her comparison of the text of 2 books, one held open on either knee. The glow of Saidar shone around her, and she was maintaining a shield on Lyanna, but there was no reason for her to look once it had been woven. Egwene lost no time in rushing to thrust her hand through the iron latticework and clasp Lyanna's. "Silviana told me they finally believe who you are," she said, laughing. "But I didn't expect to find you in such luxury." It was luxury only when held up alongside the small, dark cells where a sister might be held for trial, with rushes on the floor for a mattress, and a blanket only if you were lucky. Yet Lyanna's accommodations did appear reasonably comfortable. She had a small bed that looked softer than those in the novice quarters, a ladder-back chair with a tasseled blue cushion, and a table that held 3 books, and a tray with the remains of her supper. There was even a washstand, though the white pitcher and bowl both had chips, and the mirror was bubbled, and a privacy screen, opaque enough that she would be only a shadowy shape behind it, hid the chamber pot. Lyanna laughed, too. "Oh, I'm very popular," she said briskly. Even the way she stood seemed languorous, the very image of a seductive Damani despite plain dark woolens. But that brisk voice remained from before she had decided to remake herself as she wanted to be. "I've had a steady stream of visitors all day, from every Ajah except the Red. Even the Greens try to convince me to teach them how to travel, and they mainly want to get their hands on me because I claim to be green now." She shivered much too ostentatiously for it to be real. "That would be as bad as being back with Malaire and Desala. Dreadful woman, Desala." Her smile faded away like mist in a noonday sun. "They told me they'd put you in white. Better than the alternatives, I suppose. They give you Forkroot? Me too." Surprised, Egwene glanced toward the sister holding the shield, and Lyanna snorted. "Custom. If I weren't shielded, I could swat a fly and not hurt it. But custom says a woman in the open cells is always shielded. But they just let you wander around otherwise?" "Not exactly," Egwene said dryly. "There are 2 Reds waiting outside to escort me to my room and shield me from sleep." Lyanna sighed. "So, I'm in a cell, you're being watched, and we're both full of Forkroot tea." She cast a sidelong look at the 2 Browns. Falana was still intent on her writing. Delevian turned pages in the 2 books on her knees and began muttering under her breath. The warder must have intended to shave with that dagger, he was honing it so keen. His main attention seemed to be on the doorway, though. Lyanna lowered her voice. "So when do we escape?" "We don't," Egwene told her, and related her reasons and her plan in a near whisper while watching the sisters out of the corner of her eye. She told Lyanna everything she had seen and done. It was hard to tell how many times she had been spanked that day, and how she had behaved during, but necessary to convince the other woman that she would not be broken. I can see any sort of raid is out of the question, but I'd hoped. The warder shifted, and Liana cut off, but he was merely sheathing his dagger. Folding his arms across his chest and stretching his legs out, he leaned back against the wall, his eyes on the doorway. He looked as if he could be on his feet in the blink of an eye. Laris helped me escape once, she went on softly, but I don't know that she would do it again. She shivered, and there was nothing fake about it this time. She had been stilled when Laris helped her and Swan to escape. She did it for men more than for Swan or me, anyway. Are you certain about this? A hard woman, Silviana Brehan. Fair, so I hear, but hard enough to break iron. Are you absolutely certain, Mother? When Egwene said that she was, Liana sighed again. Well, we'll be two worms gnawing at the root then, won't we? It was not a question. She visited Liana every night that exhaustion failed to drag her to her bed straight after supper, and found her astonishingly sanguine for a prisoner confined to a cell. Liana's stream of visiting sisters was continuing, and she slipped the tidbits Egwene suggested into every conversation. Those visitors could not order an Aes Sedai punished, even one held in the open cells, though a few grew angry enough to wish they could. And besides, hearing those things from a sister carried more weight than hearing them from one they saw as a novice. Liana could even argue openly, at least until the visitors stalked out. But she reported that many did not. A few agreed with her. Cautiously, hesitantly, perhaps on one point and not others, but they agreed. Almost as important, to Liana at least, some of the Greens decided that since she had been stilled and thus was no longer Aes Sedai for a time, she had the right to ask admission to any Ajah once she was a sister again. Not all, by any means, but few was better than none. Egwene began to think that Liana in her cell was having more effect than she was roaming free. Well, free after a fashion. She was not exactly jealous. This was important work they were doing, and it did not matter which of them did it better so long as it got done. But there were times when it made the trek to Silviana's study much harder. Still, she had successes, of a sort. That first afternoon, in Benai Nalsad's cluttered sitting room, books stood in haphazard stacks everywhere on the floor tiles, and the shelves were full of bones and skulls and the preserved skins of animals, birds, and snakes, along with stuffed examples of some of the smaller specimens. A large brown lizard was perched on the huge skull of a bear, so still you would have thought it stuffed as well, until it blinked. That first afternoon, the Shienaran Brown asked her to perform an exhaustive set of weaves, one after the other. Benai sat in a high-backed chair on one side of the brown-streaked marble fireplace, she, with decided discomfort, in one on the other. She had not been invited to sit, but neither had Benai objected. Egwene performed each weave as asked until Benai casually asked for the weave for traveling, and then she merely smiled and folded her hands in her lap. The sister leaned back and adjusted her deep brown silk skirts a hair. Benai's eyes were blue and sharp, her dark hair caught in a silver net, liberally streaked with gray. Ink stains marked two of her fingers, and another smudged the side of her nose. She held a porcelain cup of tea, but she had not offered any to Egwene. I think there is little of the power that remains for you to learn, child, especially considering your wonderful discoveries. Egwene inclined her head, accepting the compliment. Some of those things truly were her discoveries, and it hardly mattered now in any case. But that hardly means you have nothing to learn. You had few novice classes before you. The Brown frowned at Egwene's white dress and cleared her throat. And fewer lessons well, later. Tell me, if you can, what mistakes did Shine Chunla make that caused the Third War of Garen's Wall? What were the causes of the Great Winter War between Andor and Cairhien? What caused the Wykin Rebellion, and how did it end? Most of history seems to be the study of wars, and the important parts of that are how and why they began and how and why ended. A great many wars would never have taken place if people had paid attention to the mistakes others had made. Well, Shine didn't make any mistakes, Egwene said slowly. But you're right, I do have a lot to learn. I don't even know the names of those other wars. Rising, she poured herself a cup of tea from the silver pitcher on the side table. Aside from the rope-work silver tray, the tabletop held a stuffed lynx and the skull of a serpent. That was as big as a man's skull. Ben-I frowned, but not for the tea. She hardly seemed to notice that. What do you mean Shine didn't make any mistakes, child? Why, she bungled the situation as badly as ever I've heard of. Well before the Third War of Garen's Wall, Egwene said, returning to her chair. Shine was doing exactly as the Hall told her, and nothing they didn't. She might be lacking in other areas of history, but the Swan had tutored her thoroughly in the mistakes made by other Amaryllis, and this particular question gave her an opening. Sitting down normally took a great effort. What are you talking about? She tried running the tower with an iron hand, never a compromise on anything, running roughshod over any opposition. The Hall grew tired of it, but they couldn't settle on a replacement. So rather than deposing her, they did worse. They left her in place and forced a penance on her whenever she tried to issue an order of any kind. Any kind at all. She knew she was going on, sounding as if she were the one giving a lecture, but she had to get it all out. Not easing herself on the hard wood of the chair seat was difficult. Welcome the pain. The Hall ran Shine and the tower, but they mishandled a great deal themselves, largely because each Aja had its own goals and there was no hand to shape them into a goal for the tower. Shine's reign was marked by wars all over the map. Eventually, the sisters themselves got tired of the Hall's bungling. In one of the 6 mutinies in tower history, Shine and the Hall were pulled down. I know she supposedly died in the Tower of Natural Causes, but in fact she was smothered in her bed in exile 51 years later after the discovery of a plot to put her back on the Amerlin seat. Mutinies? Ben-I said incredulously. 6 of them? Exiled and smothered? It's all recorded in the secret histories, in the 13th depository. Though I suppose I shouldn't have told you that. Egwene took a sip of tea and grimaced. It was all but rancid. No wonder Ben-I had not touched hers. Secret histories? A 13th depository? If such a thing existed, and I think I would know, why should you not have told me? Because by law, the existence of the secret histories as well as their contents can be known only to the Amerlin, the Keeper, and the Sitters. Them and the librarians who keep the records, anyway. Even the law itself is part of the 13th depository, so I guess I shouldn't have told that either. But if you can gain access somehow, or ask someone who knows and will tell you, you'll find out I'm right. 6 times in the history of the tower when the Amerlin was dangerously divisive or dangerously incompetent, and the Hall failed to act, sisters have risen up to remove her. There. She could not have planted the seed deeper with a shovel, or driven it home more bluntly with a hammer. Ben-I stared at her for a long moment, then raised the cup to her lips. She spluttered as soon as the tea touched her tongue and began dabbing at the spots on her dress with a delicate lace-edged handkerchief. The great winter war, she said huskily as she set the cup on the floor beside her chair, began late in the year 671. She did not mention secret records or mutinies again, but she did not have to. More than once during the lesson she trailed off, frowning at something beyond Egwene, and Egwene had little doubt what it was. Later that day, Lyrene Dwarelin said, Yes, Elida made a vital mistake there, pacing up and down in front of her sitting room's fireplace. The Cairienin sister was only a little shorter than Egwene, but the nervous way her eyes darted gave her the air of a hunted thing, a sparrow fearful of cats, and convinced there were lots of cats in the vicinity. Her dark green skirts had only 4 discreet slashes of red, though she had been a sitter once. That proclamation of hers on top of trying to kidnap him could not have been better calculated to keep the Althor boy as power as he can stay. Oh, she has made mistakes, Elida has. Egwene wanted to ask about Rand and kidnapping. Kidnapping? But Lyrene left no opening as she went on about Elida's many mistakes, all the while pacing back and forth, her eyes darting and her hands twisting unconsciously. Egwene was unsure whether or not that session could be called a success, but at least it was not a failure, and she had learned something. Not all of her forays went so well, of course. "This is not a discussion," Pratella Narbaijan said. Her tone was utterly calm, yet her tilted green eyes were heated. Her room looked more those of a green than a yellow, with several bared swords hanging on the walls, and a silk tapestry showing men fighting Trollocs. She was gripping the hilt of the dagger at her woven silver belt. Not a simple belt knife. A dagger with a blade near a foot long and an emerald capping its pommel. Why she had agreed to lecture Egwene was a mystery, given her dislike of teaching. Perhaps because it was Egwene. "You are here for a lesson on the limits of power. A very basic lesson, suitable for a novice." Egwene wanted to shift on the three-legged stool that Pratella had given her for a seat, but instead she concentrated on the smarting, focused on drinking it in, on welcoming it. She had already seen 3 visits to Sylviana, and she could sense a 4th coming, with the midday meal an hour off yet. "I merely said that if Shemaren could be reduced from Aes Sedai to accepted, then Elida's power has no limits. At least she thinks it doesn't. But if you accept that, then it really doesn't." Pratella's grip tightened on the dagger's hilt until her knuckles showed white, yet she seemed unaware. "Since you think you know better than I," she said coolly, "you can visit Sylviana when you finish." A partial response. Egwene would have said Pratella's anger was for her. "I proper you," Sarancha Colvine told her firmly. The word to describe the Grey sister was pinched. A pinched mouth and a pinched nose that constantly seemed to be detecting a bad smell. Even her pale blue eyes seemed pinched with disapproval. She might well have been pretty otherwise. "Do you understand?" "I understand," Egwene said, sitting down on the stool that had been placed in front of Sarancha's high-backed chair. The morning was cool, and a small fire burned on the stone hearth. "Drink in the pain. Welcome the pain." "An incorrect response," Sarancha said. "The correct response would have been a curtsy, and I understand, Sarancha Sedai. I intend to make a list of your failures and tell to Sylviana when we're done. Again, do you understand, child?" "I understand," Egwene said, without rising. Aes Sedai Serenity or no Aes Sedai Serenity, Sarancha's face turned purple. In the end, her list covered 4 pages in a tight, cramped hand. She spent more time writing than she did lecturing. Not a success. And then there was Avalon Basine. The Saldean really managed stateliness in spite of being so much taller than Egwene, a regal, commanding air that might have been intimidating with it. "I hear you make trouble," she said, picking up an ivory-backed hairbrush from a small inlaid table beside her chair. "If you try to make trouble with me, you'll learn that I know how to use this." Egwene did learn, without trying. 3 times she went across Adalorna's lap, and the woman did indeed know how to use a hairbrush from her hand. That managed to cut an hour lecture to 2. "May I go now?" Egwene said at last, calmly drying her cheeks as well as she could with a handkerchief that was already damp. "Breathe in the pain, absorb the fire. I'm supposed to fetch water out to the head, and I don't want to be late." Adalorna frowned at the hairbrush before returning it to the table that Egwene had overset twice with her kicking. Then she frowned at Egwene, studying her as if trying to see inside her skull. "I wish Cadsuane were in the tower," she murmured. "I think she'd find you a challenge." There seemed a touch of respect in her voice. This day was a turning point in her life. For one thing, Sylviana decided that Egwene was to receive healing twice each day. "You seem to invite being beaten, child. It's pure stubbornness, and I won't put up with it." You will face reality. The next time you visit me, we'll see how you like the strap. The Mistress of Novices folded Egwene's shift over her back, then paused. Are you smart? Did I say something amusing? I just thought of something funny, Egwene said. Nothing of consequence. Not of consequence to Sylviana, anyway. She had realized how to welcome the pain. She was fighting a war, not a single battle, and every time she was beaten, every time she was sent to Sylviana, it was a sign that she had fought another battle and refused to yield. The pain was a badge of honor. She howled and kicked as hard as ever during that slippering, but while she was drying her cheeks afterward, she hummed quietly to herself. It was easy to welcome a badge of honor. Attitudes among the novices began to shift by the second day of her captivity. It seemed that Nicola and Arena, who was working in the stables and often came to visit Nicola, they seemed so close that Egwene wondered whether they had become pillow friends, always with their heads together and smiling smiles. Nicola and Arena had regaled them all with tales of her, very inflated tales. The two women had made her seem a combination of every legendary sister in the histories, along with Birgitta Silverbow and Amaryssu herself, carrying the sword of the sun into battle. Half of them seemed in awe of her, the others angry with her for some reason, or outright scornful. Foolishly, some tried to emulate her behavior in their classes, but a flurry of visits to Sylviana quelled that. At the midday meal of the third day, nearly 24 novices ate standing up and red-faced with Nicola among them, and Albastir, surprisingly. That number dropped to 7 at supper, and on the fourth day only Nicola and the Kyrianan girl did so, and that was the end of that. She expected some might resent the fact that she continued to refuse to bend while they had been put back on the straight and narrow so quickly, but to the contrary, it only seemed to decrease the number who were angry or scornful and increase the respect. No one tried to become her friend, but it was just as well. White dress or no white dress, she was Aes Sedai, and it was improper for an Aes Sedai to befriend a novice. There was too much risk the girl would start feeling above herself and get into trouble for it. Novices began coming to her for advice, for help learning their lessons, though. Only a handful at first, but the number grew day by day. She was willing to help them learn, which was usually just a matter of strengthening a girl's confidence, or convincing a young woman that caution was wise, or taking them patiently through the steps of a weave that was giving trouble. Novices were forbidden to channel without an Aes Sedai or Accepted present, though they nearly always did in secret anyway. But she was a sister. She refused to help more than one at a time, however. Word of groups would surely leak out, and she would not be the only one sent to Sylviana. She would make that trip as often as necessary, but she did not want to earn it for others. And as for advice, with the novices kept strictly clear of men, advice was easy, though strains between pillow friends could be as harsh as anything men ever caused. One evening, returning from yet another session with Sylviana, she overheard Nicola talking to two novices who could not have been more than 15 or 16. Egwene hardly remembered being that young. It seemed a lifetime ago. Mara was a stocky Mirandian with mischievous blue eyes. Namine, a tall, slim Damani who giggled incessantly. Ask the mother, Nicola said. A few of the novices had taken to calling Egwene that, though never where anyone not wearing white could hear. They were foolish, but not utter fools. She's always willing to give advice. Namine giggled nervously and wriggled. I wouldn't want to bother her. Besides, Mara said, a lilt in her voice, they say she always gives the same advice she does. And good advice it is, too. Nicola held up one hand to tick off fingers. Obey the Aes Sedai. Obey the Accepted. Work hard. Then work harder. Gliding on toward her room, Egwene smiled. She had been unable to make Nicola behave properly while she was openly Amyrlin, but it seemed she might have succeeded while masquerading as a novice herself. Remarkable. There was one more thing she could do for them. Comfort them. Impossible as it seemed at first, The interior of the tower sometimes changed. People got lost trying to find rooms they had been to dozens of times. Women were seen walking out of walls or into them, often in dresses of old-fashioned cut, sometimes in bizarre garb, dresses that seemed simply lengths of brightly colored cloth folded around the body, embroidered ankle-length tabards worn over wide trousers, stranger things still. Light! When could any woman have wanted to wear a dress that left her bosom completely exposed? Egwene was able to discuss it with Swan in Tel'aran'rhiod, so she knew that these things were signs of the approach of Tarmon Gai'don. An unpleasant thought, yet there was nothing to be done about it. What was, and it was not as if Rand himself was not a herald of the last battle. Some of the sisters in the tower must have known what it all meant, too, but wrapped up in their own affairs, they made no effort to comfort novices who were weeping with fright. Egwene did. "The world is full of strange wonders," she told Corrida, a pale-haired girl who was sobbing face down on her bed. Only a year younger than herself, Corrida was most definitely still a girl, despite a year and a half in the tower. I'd be surprised if some of those wonders appear in the White Tower. What better place? She never mentioned the last battle to these girls. That was hardly likely to be any comfort. "But she walked into a wall," Corrida wailed, raising her head. Her face was red and blotchy, and her cheeks glistened damply. "A wall! And then none of us could find the classroom, and Pedra couldn't either, and she got cross with us. Pedra never gets cross. She was frightened, too." "I'll wager Pedra didn't start crying, though." Egwene sat down on the edge of the girl's bed and was pleased that she did not wince. Novice mattresses were not noted for softness. "The dead can't harm the living, Corrida. They can't touch us. They don't even seem to see us. Besides, they were initiates of the tower or else servants here. This was their home as much as it is ours. And as for rooms or hallways not being where they're supposed to be, just remember that the tower's a place of wonders. Remember that, and they won't frighten you." It seemed feeble to her, but Corrida wiped her eyes and swore she would never be frightened again. Unfortunately, there were 102 like her, not all so easily comforted. It was enough to make Egwene angrier at the sisters in the tower than she already had been. Her days were not all lessons and comforting novices and being punished by the mistress of novices, though the last did take up an unfortunate amount of each day. Silviana had been right to doubt that she would have much free time. Novices were always given chores. Often it was make work, since the tower had well over 1,000 serving men and women without counting laborers. But physical work helped build character, so the tower had always believed. Plus it helped keep the novices too tired to think of men, supposedly. She was loaded down with chores beyond what the novices were given, though. Some were assigned by sisters who considered her a runaway, others by Silviana in the hope that weariness would dull the edge of her rebellion. Daily, after one meal or another, she scrubbed dirty pots with coarse salt and a stiff brush in the workroom off the main kitchen. From time to time, Laras would put her head in, but she never spoke. And she never used her long spoon, even when Egwene was massaging the small of her back, aching from being head down in a large kettle rather than scrubbing. Laras dealt out smacks aplenty to scullions and undercooks who tried to play pranks on Egwene, as was customary with novices sent to work in the kitchen. Supposedly that was just because, as she announced loudly every time she gave a thwack, they had plenty of time to play when they were not supposed to be working, but Egwene noticed that Laras was not so quick when someone goosed one of the true novices, or tipped a cup of cold water down the back of her neck. It seemed she did have an ally of sorts, if she could only figure out how to make use of her. She hauled water in buckets hanging from the ends of a pole balanced across her shoulders to the kitchen, to the novices' quarters, to the accepteds' quarters, all the way up to the Ajah quarters. She carried meals to sisters in their rooms, raked garden paths, pulled weeds, ran errands for sisters, attended sitters, swept floors, mopped floors, scrubbed floors on her hands and knees, and that was only a partial list. She never shirked at these tasks, and only in part because she would not give anyone an excuse to call her lazy. In a way, she viewed them as penance for not having prepared properly before turning the harbor chain to Quendiar. Penances were to be borne with dignity, as much dignity as anyone can have while scrubbing a floor, anyway. Besides, visiting the Accepted's quarters gave her a chance to see how they viewed her. There were 31 in the tower, but at any given time some were teaching novices and others taking lessons of their own, so she seldom found more than 10 or 12 in their rooms, around the 9-tiered well surrounding a small garden. Word of her arrival always spread quickly, though, and she never lacked an audience. At first, many of them tried to overwhelm her with orders, especially Mare, a plump, blue-eyed Arafellan, and Assail, a slim Tarabonner with pale hair and brown eyes. They had been novices when she came to the tower, and already jealous of her quick rise to Accepted when she left. With them, every second sentence was fetch that or carry this there. For all of them, she was the novice who had caused so much difficulty, the novice who thought she was the Amyrlin's seat. She carried pails of water till her back ached, uncomplaining, yet she refused to obey their commands, which earned her more visits to the Mistress of Novices, of course. As the days passed, as her continual trips to Silviana's study showed no effect, however, that flow of commands dwindled and finally ceased. Even Assail and Mare had not really been trying to be mean, only to behave as they thought they should in the circumstances, and they were at a loss as to what to do with her. Some of the Accepted showed signs of fright at the dead walking and the interior of the tower changing, and whenever she saw a bloodless face or teary eyes, she would say the same things she told the novices. Not addressing the woman directly, which might have gotten her back up rather than soothing her, but as if talking to herself. It worked as well with Accepted as with novices. Many gave a start when she began, or opened their mouths as though to tell her to be quiet, yet none did, and she always left a thoughtful expression behind. The Accepted continued to come out onto the stone-railed galleries when she entered, but they watched her in silence as though wondering what she was. Eventually she would teach them what she was. Them and the sisters, too. Attending sitters and sisters, a woman in white standing quietly in the corner quickly became part of the furniture, even when she was notorious. If they noticed her, they changed their conversation, yet she overheard many snippets, often of plots to avenge some slight given or wrong done by another Ajah. Oddly, most of the sisters seemed to see the other Ajahs inside the tower as more their enemies than they did the sisters in the camp outside the city. And the sitters were not much better. It made her want to slap them. True, it boded well for relations when the other sisters returned to the tower, but still. She did pick up other things. The unbelievable disaster that had befallen an expedition sent against the Black Tower. Some of the sisters seemed not to believe it, yet they appeared to be trying to convince themselves it could not have happened. More sisters captured after a great battle, and somehow forced to swear fealty to Rand. She had already had inklings of that, and she could not like it any more than she did sisters being bonded by ta'Shaman. Being ta'Veren or the Dragon Reborn was no excuse. No Aes Sedai had ever before sworn fealty to any man. The sisters and sitters argued over who was to blame, with Rand and the ta'Shaman at the head of the list. But one name came up again and again: Elaida do Avrinia Roihan. They talked of Rand, too, of how to find him before Tarmon Gaiden. They knew it was coming, despite their failure to console the novices and Accepted, and they were desperate to lay hands on him. Sometimes she risked a comment, a mention of Shemaren being stripped of the shawl against all custom, a suggestion that Elaida's edict regarding Rand was the best way in the world to make him dig in his heels. She offered sympathy for the sisters captured by the ta'Shaman, for those taken at Dumai's Wells, with Elaida's name dropped in, or regretted the neglect that saw garbage rotting in the once pristine streets of Tar Valon. There was no need to mention Elaida there. They knew who was responsible for Tar Valon. At times, those comments earned her still more trips to Silviana's study, and more chores besides, yet surprisingly often they did not. She made careful note of the sisters who merely told her to be quiet, or better still, said nothing. Some even nodded agreement before they caught themselves. Some of those chores led to interesting encounters. On the morning of her second day, she was using a long-handled bamboo rake to fish detritus from the ponds of the water garden. There had been a rainstorm the night before, and the heavy winds had deposited leaves and grasses in the ponds among the bright green lily pads and budding water irises, and even a dead sparrow that she calmly buried in one of the flower beds. A pair of reds stood on one of the arching pond bridges, leaning on the lacy stone railing and watching her, and the fish swirling below them in a flurry of red and gold and white. A half-dozen crows burst up out of one of the leather leaves and silently winged their way north. Crows? The tower grounds were supposed to be warded against crows and ravens. The reds did not seem to have noticed. She was squatting on her heels beside one of the ponds, washing the dirt from her hands after burying that pitiful bird, when Alviarin appeared, her white-fringed shawl wrapped tightly around her, as if the morning were still windy rather than bright and fair. This was the third time she had seen Alviarin, and every time she had been alone rather than in company with other whites. She had seen clusters of whites in the hallways, though. Was there a clue in that? If so, she could not imagine to what, unless Alviarin was being shunned by her own Aja for some reason. Surely the rot had not gone that deep. Eyeing the reds, Alviarin approached Egwene along the coarse gravel path that wound among the ponds. "You have fallen far," she said when she was close. "You must feel it keenly." Egwene straightened and blotted her hands on her skirt, then picked up the rake. "I'm not the only one." She had had another session with Silviana before dawn, and when she left the woman's study, Alviarin had been waiting to go in again. That was a daily ritual for the white, and the talk of the novices' quarters, with every tongue speculating on the why of it. "My mother always says, don't weep over what can't be mended. It seems good advice under the circumstances." Faint spots of color appeared in Alviarin's cheeks. "But you seem to be weeping a good deal, endlessly by all reports. Surely you would escape that if you could." Egwene caught another oak leaf on the broom and brushed it off into the wooden pail of damp leaves at her feet. "Your loyalty to Elaida isn't very strong, is it?" "Why do you say that?" Alviarin said suspiciously. Glancing at the two reds, who appeared to be paying more mind now to the fish than Egwene, she stepped closer, inviting lowered voices. Egwene fished at a long strand of grass that had to have come all the way from the plains beyond the river. Should she mention the letter this woman had written to Rand, practically promising him the White Tower at his feet? No. That piece of information might prove valuable, but it seemed the sort of thing that could only be used once. "She stripped you of the Keeper's stole and ordered your penance. That's hardly an inducement to loyalty." Alviarin's face remained smooth, yet her shoulders relaxed visibly. Aes Sedai seldom showed so much. She must feel under phenomenal strain to be so little in control of herself. She darted a look at the reds again. "Think on your situation," she said in near a whisper. "If you want an escape from it, well, you may be able to find one." "I am content with my situation," Egwene said simply. Alviarin's eyebrows quirked upwards in disbelief, but with another glance at the reds, one was watching them now rather than the fish, she glided away, a very fast glide, on the verge of breaking into a trot. Every 2 or 3 days she would appear while Egwene was doing chores, and while she never openly offered help with an escape, she used that word frequently, and she began to show frustration when Egwene refused to rise to her bait. Bait it was, to be sure. Egwene did not trust the woman. Perhaps it was that letter, surely designed to draw Rand to the tower and into Elaida's clutches. Or maybe it was the way she kept waiting for Egwene to make the first move, to beg, possibly. Likely Alviarin would try to set conditions then. In any case, she had no intention of escaping unless there was no other choice, so she always gave the same response. "I am content with my situation." Alviarin began grinding her teeth audibly when she heard that. On the 4th day, she was on her hands and knees, scrubbing blue and white floor tiles, when the boots of 3 men, accompanied by a sister in elaborately red-embroidered gray silk, passed her. A few paces on, the boots stopped. That be her, a man's voice said in the accents of Ilion. She did be pointed out to me. I think I will speak to her. She's only another novice, Matin Stepaneus, the sister told him. You wanted to walk in the gardens. Egwene dipped her scrub brush in the bucket of soapy water and began another stretch of tiles. Fortune stab me, Cariandra. This may be the White Tower, but I do still be the lawful king of Ilion. And if I want to speak to her, with you for chaperone, all very proper and decent, then I will speak with her. I did be told she did grow up in the same village with Althor. One set of boots, blacked till they glistened, approached Egwene. Only then did she stand, the dripping brush in one hand. She used the back of the other to brush her hair out of her face. She refrained from knuckling the small of her back, much as she wanted to. Matin Stepaneus was stocky and almost entirely bald, with a neatly trimmed white beard in the Illianer fashion and a heavily creased face. His eyes were sharp and angry. Armor would have suited him better than the green silk coat embroidered with golden bees on the sleeves and lapels. Just another novice, he murmured. I think you be mistaken, Cariandra. The plump red, her lips compressed, left the two serving men with the flame of Tar-Valon on their chests and joined the balding man. Her disapproving gaze touched Egwene briefly before shifting to him. She's a much-punished novice who has a floor to scrub. Come, the gardens should be very pleasant this morning. What be pleasant, he said. Do be talking to someone other than Aes Sedai, and only of the Red Ajah at that, since you do manage to keep me from any others. On top of which, the servants you did give me might as well be mutes, and I think the tower guards do have orders to hold their tongues around me as well. He fell silent as two more red sisters approached. Nesita, plump and blue-eyed and mean as a snake with the itch, nodded companionably to Cariandra, while Barrisine handed Egwene the by now all too familiar pewter cup. The Reds seemed to have custody of her in a way. At least her watchers and minders were always Reds, and they seldom let much more than the promised hour pass before someone appeared with the cup of fork-root tea. She drained it and handed it back. Nesita seemed disappointed that she did not protest or refuse, but there seemed little point. She had once, and Nesita had helped pour the vile stuff down her throat using a funnel she had ready in her belt pouch. That would have been a fine show of dignity in front of Matin Stepaneus. He watched the silent exchange with puzzled interest, though Cariandra plucked at his sleeve, urging him again to his walk in the gardens. Sisters, bring you water when you thirst? He asked when Barrisine and Nesita glided away. A tea they think will improve my mood, she told him. You look well, Matin Stepaneus, for a man Elaida had kidnapped. That tale was the talk of the novices' quarters, too. Cariandra hissed and opened her mouth, but he spoke up first, his jaw tight. Elaida did save me from murder by Althor, he said. The Red nodded approvingly. Why would you think yourself in danger from him? Egwene asked. The man grunted. He did murder Morghese in Caemlyn, and Cola Vare in Cairhien. He destroyed half the Sun Palace, killing her, I did hear. And I did hear of Tyrant High Lords poisoned or stabbed to death in Cairhien. Who can say what other rulers he will murder and destroy the bodies? Cariandra nodded again, smiling. You might have thought him a boy reciting his lessons. Did the woman have no understanding of men? He certainly saw it. His jaw grew harder still, and his hands clenched into fists for a moment. Cola Vare hanged herself, Egwene said, making sure she sounded patient. The Sun Palace was damaged later by someone trying to kill the Dragon Reborn, maybe the Forsaken, and according to Elaine Trakand, her mother was murdered by Ravine. Rand has announced his support for her claims to both the Lion Throne and the Sun Throne. He hasn't killed any of the Cairhien nobles rebelling against him, or the High Lords in rebellion. In fact, he named one of them his steward in Tyr. I think that is quite, Cariandra began, pulling her shawl up onto her shoulders, but Egwene went on right over her. Any sister could have told you all that, if she wanted to, if they were speaking to one another. Think why you see only red sisters. Have you seen sisters of any two Ajas speaking? You've been kidnapped and brought aboard a sinking ship. That is more than enough, Cariandra snapped, right atop Egwene's last sentence. When you finish scrubbing this floor, you will run to the Mistress of Novices and ask her to punish you for shirking, and for showing disrespect to an Aes Sedai. Egwene met the woman's furious gaze calmly. I have barely enough time after I finish to get clean before my lesson with Kiyoshi. Could I visit Silviana after the lesson? Cariandra shifted her shawl, seemingly taken aback by her calmness. That is a problem for you to work out, she said at last. Come, Matin Stepaneus, you have helped this child shirk long enough. There was no time to change out of her damp dress or even comb her hair after leaving Silviana's study, not if she were to have any hope of being on time for Kiyoshi without running, which she refused to do. That made her late, and it turned out that the tall, slender Grey was a stickler for both punctuality and neatness, which put her back yelping and kicking under Silviana's hard-swung strap little more than an hour later. Quite aside from embracing pain, something else helped see her through that. The memory of Matin Stepaneus's thoughtful expression as Cariandra led him off down the corridor, and how he twice looked back over his shoulder at her. She had planted another seed. Enough seeds planted, and perhaps what sprouted from them would splinter those cracks in the platform beneath Elaida. Enough seeds would bring Elaida down. Early on her 7th day of captivity, she was carrying water up the tower again, to the White Aja quarters this time, when she suddenly stopped in her tracks, feeling as if she had been punched in her stomach hard. 2 women in gray-fringed shawls were walking down the spiraling corridor toward her, trailed by a pair of warders. One was Melaver Somenelen, a stout Cairienin in fine gray wool with white flecking her dark hair. The other, with blue eyes and dark honey hair, was Bayanin. So you're the one who betrayed me, Egwene said angrily. A thought occurred to her. How could Bayanin have betrayed her after swearing fealty? You must be Black Aja. Melaver drew herself up as much as she could, which was not very far, since she was inches shorter than Egwene, and planted her fists on her ample hips as she opened her mouth to deliver a blast. Egwene had had one lesson from her, and while she was a kindly woman usually, when she became angry she could be fearsome. Bayanin laid a hand on the other sister's plump arm. Let me speak to her alone, please, Melaver. I trust you will speak sharply, Melaver said in a stiff voice. To even think of making such a charge. To even mention some things. Shaking her head in disgust, she retreated a little up the corridor, followed by her warder, squat and even wider than she, a bear of a man, though he moved with the expected warder grace. Bayanin gestured and waited until her own warder, a lean man with a long scar on his face, joined them. She adjusted her shawl several times. I betrayed nothing, she said quietly. I would not have sworn to you except that the Hall, it would have had me birched if it learned the secrets you knew. Perhaps more than once, even. Reason enough to swear, no? I never pretended to love you, yet I maintained that oath until you were captured. But you are no longer Amyrlin, yes? Not as a captive, not when there was no hope of rescuing you, when you refused rescue. And you are a novice once more. So that oath, it has 2 reasons to hold no longer. The talk of rebellion, it was wild talk. The rebellion is finished. The White Tower, it will soon be whole again, and I will not be sorry to see it so. Lifting the pole from her shoulders, Egwene set down the pails of water and folded her arms beneath her breasts. She had tried to maintain a calm demeanor since being captured. Well, except when she was being punished. But this encounter would have tried a stone. You explain yourself at great length, she said dryly. Are you trying to convince yourself? It won't do, Bayanin. It won't do. If the rebellion is finished, where is the flood of sisters coming to kneel before Elaida and accept her penance? Light. What else have you betrayed? Everything? It seemed likely. She had visited Elaida's study a number of times in Tel'aran'rhiod, but the woman's correspondence box had always been empty. Now she knew why. Sharp spots of red appeared in Beanin's cheeks. I tell you I have betrayed me. She finished with a strangled grunt and put a hand to her throat as it refused to let the lie leave her tongue. That proved she was not Black Ajah, but it proved something more. You betrayed the ferrets. Are they all down in the basement cells? Beanin's eyes flashed up the corridor. Melaver was talking with her warder, his head bent close to hers. Squat or not, he was taller than she. Beanin's Tervale was watching her with a worried expression. The distance was too far for any of the three to have overheard, but Beanin stepped closer and lowered her voice. Elida, she is having them watched, though I think the Ajahs, they keep what they see to themselves. Few sisters want to tell Elida any more than they must. It was necessary, you understand. I could hardly return to the tower and keep them secret. It would have been discovered eventually. Then you'll have to warn them. Egwene could not keep her voice clear of her disdain. This woman split hairs with a razor. She took the thinnest excuse to decide her oath no longer applied, and then she betrayed the very women she had helped choose. Blood and bloody ashes. Beanin remained silent for a long moment, fiddling with her shawl, but at last she said, surprisingly, I have already warned Maidani and Janet. They were the two greys among the ferrets. I have done what I can for them. The others, they must sink or swim by themselves. Sisters have been assaulted for simply going too near another Ajah's quarters. Me, I will not walk back to my rooms, clad only in my shawl and the welts, just to try. Think of it as a penance, Egwene cut in. Light, sisters assaulted. Things were even worse than she had thought. She had to remind herself that well-manured ground would help her seeds to grow. Beanin glanced up the hallway again, and Tervale took a step toward her before Beanin shook her head. Her face was smooth, despite the color staining her cheeks, but inside she must have been in turmoil. You know I could send you to the Mistress of Novices, yes? She said in a tight voice. I hear you spend half of each day squealing for her. I think you would dislike more visits, yes? Egwene smiled at her. Not 2 hours earlier she had managed to smile the moment Sylviana's strap stopped falling. This was much harder. And who can say what I might squeal? About oaths, perhaps? The color drained from the other woman's cheeks, leaving her face bloodless pale. No, she did not want that getting out. You may have convinced yourself I am no longer Amyrlin, Beanin, but it's time to start convincing yourself that I still am. You will warn the others, whatever the cost to yourself. Tell them to stay away from me unless I send word otherwise. They've had more than enough attention drawn to them. But from now on, you'll seek me out every day in case I have instructions for them. I have some now. Quickly, she listed the things she wanted them to bring up in conversation. Shamarin being stripped of the shawl, Elida's complicity in the disasters at the Black Tower and Dumai's wells, all the seeds she had been planting. They would not be planted one by one now, but broadcast by handfuls. Me, I cannot speak for other Ajahs, Beanin said when she finished. But in the grey, sisters speak of most of these things often. The eyes and ears, they are busy of late. Secrets Elida hoped to hold, they are coming out. I am sure it must be the same in the others. Perhaps it is not necessary for me to warn them and deliver my instructions, Beanin. Egwene lifted the pole back onto her shoulders, shifting it to the most comfortable position she could find. 2 or 3 of the whites would use a hairbrush or slipper on her and send her to Sylviana if they thought her slow. Embracing pain, even welcoming it, did not mean seeking it out unnecessarily. Remember, it's a penance I've set you. I will do as you say, Beanin said with obvious reluctance. Her eyes hardened suddenly, but it was not for Egwene. It would be enjoyable to see Elida pulled down, she said in an unpleasant voice, before hurrying away to join Melaver. That shocking meeting, turned into an unexpected victory, left Egwene feeling very good about the day. And no matter that Farana did turn out to think she had been slow. The White Sitter was plump, but she had an arm as strong as Silviana's. That night she dragged herself down to the open cells after supper, despite wanting her bed in the worst way. Aside from lessons and howling under Silviana's strap, the last time just before supper, most of the rest of the day had been given to hauling water. Her back and shoulders ached. Her arms ached. Her legs. She was swaying on her feet with weariness. Strangely, she had not had one of those wretched headaches since being taken prisoner, nor any of those dark dreams that left her disturbed, even though she could never remember them. But she thought she might be heading for a fine headache tonight. That would make telling true dreams difficult, and she had had some fine ones lately, about Rand, Mat, Perrin, even Gawain, though most dreams of him were just that. 3 white sisters she knew in passing were guarding Lyanna. Nagora, a lean woman with pale hair worn in a roll on her nape, who sat very straight to make up for her lack of stature. Noreen, lovely with her large liquid eyes, but often as vague as any brown. And Miyasi, tall and plump, with iron-gray hair, a stern woman who brooked no nonsense and saw nonsense everywhere. Nagora, surrounded by the light of Saidar, held the shield on Lyanna, but they were arguing over some point of logic that Egwene could not make out from the little she heard. She could not even tell whether there were 2 sides to the argument or 3. There were no raised voices, no shaken fists, and their faces remained smooth Aes Sedai masks, but the coldness in their voices left no doubt that had they not been Aes Sedai, they would have been shouting, if not trading blows. She might as well not have existed for all the attention they paid her entrance. Watching the 3 from the edge of her eye, she moved as close to the iron latticework as she could and gripped it with both hands to steady herself, like she was tired. "I saw Bayanin today," she said softly. "She's here in the tower. She claimed her oath to me no longer held because I was no longer the Amaran seat." Lyanna gasped and stepped near enough that she was brushing the iron bars. "She betrayed us?" "The inherent impossibility of dissimulated structures is a given," Nagora said firmly. Her voice was an icy hammer. "A given." "She denies it, and I believe her," Egwene whispered. "But she admitted betraying the ferrets. Elaida is only having them watched for the moment, but I told Bayanin to warn them, and she said she would. She said she'd already warned Maidani and Jennet, but why would she betray them and then tell them about it? And she said she would like to see Elaida pulled down. Why would she flee to Elaida if she still wants her brought down? She as much admitted no one else has abandoned our cause. I'm missing something, and I'm too tired to see what it is." A yawn that she barely managed to cover with a hand cracked her jaw. "Dissimulated structures are implied by 4 of the 5 axioms of 6th order rationality," Miyasi said just as firmly. "Strongly implied." "So-called 6th order rationality has been discarded as an aberration by anyone with intellect," Noreen put in, a touch sharply. "But dissimulated structures are fundamental to any possibility of understanding what is happening right here in the tower every day. Reality itself is shifting, changing day by day." Lyanna glanced at the whites. "Some always thought Elaida had spies among us. If Bayanin was one, her oath to you would have held her until she could convince herself you were no longer Amyrlin. But if her reception here wasn't what she expected, it might have changed her loyalties. Bayanin was always ambitious. If she didn't get her due as she sees matters, she spread her hands. Bayanin always expected her due, and perhaps a little more." "Logic is always applicable to the real world," Miyasi said dismissively. "But only a novice would think the real world can be applied to logic. Ideals must be first principles, not the mundane world." Nagora snapped her mouth shut with a dark look, as if she felt words had been snatched right off her tongue. Coloring faintly, Noreen rose and glided away from the benches toward Egwene. The other 2 followed her with their eyes, and she seemed to feel their gazes, shifting her shawl uncomfortably, first one way, then another. "Child, you look exhausted. Go to your bed now." Egwene wanted nothing more than her bed, but she had a question to be answered first. Only she had to be careful. The 3 whites were all paying attention now. Liana, do you think the sisters who visit you still ask the same questions? I told you to go to your bed, Noreen said sharply. She clapped her hands together as if that would somehow make Egwene obey. Yes, Liana said. I see what you mean. Perhaps there can be a measure of trust. A small measure, Egwene said. Noreen planted her fists on her hips. There was little coolness in her face or her voice, and no vagueness at all about her. Since you refuse to go to your bed, you can go to the Mistress of Novices and tell her you disobeyed a sister. Of course, Egwene said quickly, turning to go. She had her answer. Bayanin had not passed on traveling, and that meant she likely had not passed on anything else. Perhaps there could be a little trust. And besides, Nagora and Miasi were advancing on her. The last thing she wanted was to be dragged bodily to Silviana's study, something Miasi, at least, was quite capable of. She had even stronger arms than Farana. On the morning of her 9th day back in the tower, before first light, Doacine herself came to Egwene's small room to give her morning dose of healing. Outside, rain was falling with a dull roar. The two Reds who had been watching over her sleep gave her her fork root, frowning at Doacine, and hurried away. The yellow sitter snorted in contempt when the door closed behind them. She used the old method of healing that made Egwene gasp as though doused in an icy pond and left her ravenously eager for breakfast, as well as free of the pain in her bottom. That actually felt peculiar. You could adapt to anything over time, and a bruised bottom already seemed normal. But the use of the old way, the way used every time she had been given healing since being captured, reaffirmed that Bayanin had kept some secrets, though how she had managed it was still a mystery. Bayanin herself had only said that most sisters thought the tales of new weaves were merely rumors. You don't mean to bloody surrender, do you, child? Doacine said, while Egwene was pulling her dress over her head. The woman's language was very much at odds with her elegant appearance in gold-embroidered blue, with sapphires at her ears and in her hair. Should the Amerlin seat ever surrender? Egwene asked, as her head popped out at the top of her dress. She doubled her arms behind her to do up the buttons of white-dyed horn. Doacine snorted again, though not in contempt, Egwene thought. A brave course, child. Still, my wager is that Silviana will bloody well have you sitting straight and walking right before much longer. But she left without calling Egwene down for naming herself the Amerlin seat. Egwene had yet another appointment with the Mistress of Novices before breakfast. She had not missed a day so far, and following a determined effort to undo Doacine's work in one go, her tears ceased as soon as Silviana's strap stopped falling. When she lifted herself off the end of the writing table, where a leather pad was attached just for bending over, its surface worn down by who knew how many women, and her skirt and shift fell against her fiery skin, she felt no urge to flinch. She accepted the painful heat, welcomed it, warmed herself with it as she would have warmed her hands in front of a fireplace on a cold winter morning. There seemed a strong resemblance between her bottom and a blazing fireplace right that moment. Yet looking into the mirror, she saw an unruffled face, red-cheeked, but calm. How could Chimarin have been reduced to accepted? She asked, wiping her tears away with her handkerchief. I've inquired, and there's no provision for it in Tower law. How often have you been sent to me because of those inquiries? Silviana asked, hanging the split-tailed strap in the narrow cabinet alongside the leather paddle and the limber switch. I'd think you would have given over long since. I'm curious. How, when there's no provision? No provision, child, Silviana said gently, as if explaining to a child in truth. But no prohibition either. A loophole that... Well, we won't go into that. You'd only find a way to get yourself another strapping with it. Shaking her head, she took her seat behind the writing table and rested her hands on the tabletop. The problem was that Chimarin accepted it. Other sisters told her to ignore the edict, but once she realized pleading wouldn't change the Amerlin's mind, she moved into the accepted's quarters. Egwene's stomach growled loudly, anxious for breakfast, but she was not done. She was actually having a conversation with Silviana. A conversation however odd the topic. But why would she run away? Surely her friends didn't stop trying to talk sense into her. Some talked sense, Silviana said dryly. Others... She moved her hands like the pans of a balance scale, first one up, then the other. Others tried to force her see sense. They sent her to me nearly as often as you were sent. I treated her visits as private penances, but she lacked your... She stopped abruptly, leaning back in her chair and studying Egwene over steepled fingers. Well now, you actually have me chatting. Not prohibited, certainly, yet hardly proper in these circumstances. Go on to breakfast, she said, picking up her pen and opening the silver cap of her ink jar. I'll mark you down for midday again, since I know you have no intention of curtsying. The faintest hint of resignation tinged her voice. When Egwene entered the novices' dining hall, the first novice to see her stood, and suddenly there was a loud scraping of benches on the colorful floor tiles as the others rose too. They stood there at their benches in silence as Egwene walked the center aisle toward the kitchen. Suddenly, Ashellin, a plump, pretty girl from Altara, darted into the kitchen. Before Egwene reached the kitchen door, Ashellin was back with a tray in her hands that held the usual thick cup of steaming tea and plate of bread, olives, and cheese. Egwene reached for the tray, but the olive-skinned girl hurried to the nearest table and set it down in front of an empty bench, offering a suggestion of a curtsy as she backed away. Lucky for her, neither of Egwene's escorts this morning had chosen that moment to peer into the dining hall. Lucky for all those novices on their feet. A cushion rested on the bench in front of Egwene's tray, a tattered thing that was more patches and different colors than original material, but still a cushion. Egwene picked it up and set it on the end of the table before sitting down. Welcoming the pain was easy. She basked in the warmth of her own fires. A soft susurration gusted through the room, a collective sigh. Only when she popped an olive into her mouth did the novices sit. She almost spat it out again. It was not far short of spoiled, but she was famished after her healing, so she spat only the pit into the palm of her hand and deposited it on the plate, washing the taste away with a sip of tea. There was honey in the tea. Novices got honey only on special occasions. She tried not to smile as she cleaned her plate, and clean it she did, even picking up crumbs of bread and cheese with a dampened finger. Not smiling was difficult, though. First Doacine, a sitter. Then Silviana's resignation. Now this. The two sisters were far more important than the novices or the honey, but they all indicated the same thing. She was winning her war. Chapter 25. Attending Elida. Gold-embossed leather folder under her arm, Tarna kept to the central core of the tower she climbed toward Elida's apartments, although it meant using a seemingly endless series of staircases. Twice those stairs were not located where she remembered them, but so long as she continued upward, she would reach her destination, rather than the gently spiraling corridors. On the stairs, she met no one but the occasional liveried servants, who bowed or curtsied before hurrying on about their tasks. In either of the spiraling hallways, she would have to pass the entrances to the Ajah quarters, and perhaps encounter other sisters. Her keeper's stole allowed her to enter any Ajah's quarters, yet she avoided all except the red, save when duty called. Among sisters of the other Ajahs, she was all too aware that her narrow stole was red, all too aware of hot eyes watching her from cold faces. They did not unnerve her. Little did. She took the shifting interior of the tower in stride. But still... She thought matters had not gone so far that anyone would actually attack the keeper, yet she took no chances. Retrieving the situation was going to be a long, hard struggle, Elida thought, and an assault on the keeper might make it irretrievable. Besides, not having to watch over her shoulder allowed her to think on Pavara's troubling question, one she had not considered before suggesting the bonding of Ashaman. Who in the Red actually could be trusted with the task? Hunting men who could channel led Red sisters to look askance at all men, and a fair number hated them. A surviving brother or father might well escape hatred, a favorite cousin or uncle, But once they were all gone, so was affection and trust. And there was another matter of trust. Bonding any man violated custom strong as law. Even with Tsutama's blessings, who might run to Elida when bonding Ashaman was broached? She had removed 3 more names from her mental list of possibilities by the time she reached the entrance to Elida's apartments, only 2 floors below the top of the tower. After almost 2 weeks, her list of those she could be certain of still contained only a single name, and that one was impossible for the task. Elida was in her sitting room, where the furnishings were all gilt and ivory inlays, and the large patterned carpet was one of Tyr's finest creations. She was sitting in a low-backed chair before the marble fireplace, sipping wine with Maidani. Seeing the gray was no surprise, despite the early hour. Maidani dined with the Amelin most nights, and visited often during the day by invitation. Elida, her 6-striped stole wide enough to cover her shoulders, was regarding the taller woman over her crystal goblet, a dark-eyed eagle regarding a mouse with big blue eyes. Maidani, emeralds at her ears and on a wide collar around her slim throat, seemed very conscious of that gaze. Her full lips smiled, but they seemed tremulous. The hand not holding her goblet moved constantly, touching the emerald comb over her left ear, patting her hair, covering her bosom, which was largely exposed by her snug bodice of brocaded silvery gray silk. Her bosom was hardly excessive, yet her slenderness made it seem so, and she appeared about to pop free of the garment. The woman was garbed for a ball, or a seduction. "The morning reports are ready, Mother," Tarna said, bowing slightly. Light. She felt as if she had intruded on lovers. "You won't mind leaving us, Maidani?" Even the smile Elida directed at the yellow-haired woman was predatory. "Of course not, Mother." Maidani set her goblet on the small table beside her chair and leaped to her feet, offering a curtsy that nearly had her out of her dress. "Of course not." She scurried from the room, breathing hard, her eyes wide. When the door closed behind her, Elida laughed. "We were pillow friends as novices," she said, rising, "and I believe she wants to renew the relationship. I may let her. She might reveal more on the pillows than she's let slip so far, which is nothing, truth to tell." She strode to the nearest window and stood staring down toward where her fantastical palace would rise to overtop the tower itself. Eventually, if sisters could be convinced to work on it again. The heavy rain that had begun during the night was still falling, and it seemed unlikely she could see anything of that palace's foundations, all that had been completed so far. "Help yourself to wine if you wish." Tarna kept her face. Pillow friends were common among novices and accepted, but girlhood things should be left behind with girlhood. Not all sisters saw it so, certainly. Galena had been quite surprised when Tarna refused her advances after gaining the shawl. She herself found men far more attractive than women. Most seemed heavily intimidated by Aes Sedai, to be sure, especially if they learned you were Red Aja. But over the years she had come across a few who were not. "That seems odd, Mother," she said, putting the leather folder down on the side table that held an ornately wrought golden tray bearing a crystal wine pitcher and goblets. "She appears frightened of you." Filling a goblet, she sniffed the wine before sipping. The keepings seemed to be working, for now. Elida had finally agreed that weave, at least, must be shared. Almost as if she knew that you know about her being a spy. "Of course she's afraid of me." Sarcasm dripped heavily from Elida's voice, but then hardened to stone. "I want her afraid. I intend to put her through the mangle. By the time I have her birched, she'll tie herself to the birching frame if I order it. If she knew I knew, Tarna, she'd be fleeing instead of delivering herself into my hands." Still staring out into the rainstorm, she sipped at her wine. "Have you any news of the others?" "No, Mother. If I could inform the sitters of why they're to be watched—" "No!" Elida snapped, spinning to face her. Her dress was such a mass of intricate red scroll work that the embroidery all but hid the gray silk beneath. Tarna had suggested that less flaunting of her former Aja, she had phrased it more diplomatically, but that was what she meant, might help bring the Ajas together again. Yet Elida's eruption of fury had been sufficient to keep her quiet on the topic since. What if some of the sitters are working with them? I wouldn't put it past them. Those ridiculous talks continue at the bridge despite my orders. No, I wouldn't put it past them at all. Tarna inclined her head over her goblet, accepting what she could not change. Elida refused to see that if the Ajas disobeyed her order to break off the talks, they were unlikely to spy on their own sisters at her command without knowing why. Saying so would only result in another tirade, though. Elida stared at her as if to make sure she was not going to argue. The woman seemed harder than ever, and more brittle. A pity the rebellion in Tarabon failed, she said at last. There's nothing to be done about it, I suppose. But she mentioned it frequently at odd moments, since word came back that the Shanshan were reasserting their grip on that country. She was not so resigned as she pretended. I want to hear some good news, Tarna. Is there any word of the seals on the Dark One's prison? We must make sure no more get broken. As if Tarna did not know that. Not that the Ajas have reported, Mother, and I don't think they would hold that back. She wished she had those last words back as soon as they were spoken. Elida grunted. The Ajas released only trickles of what their eyes and ears told them, and she resented that bitterly. Her own eyes and ears were concentrated in Andor. How is the work coming at the harbors? Slowly, Mother. With the flow of trade stifled, the city was already feeling hunger. It would begin starving soon, unless the harbor mouths were cleared. Even cutting away the portion of the North Harbor chain that was still iron had proved not enough to allow sufficient ships in to feed Tar Valon. Once Tarna was able to convince her of the necessity, Elida had ordered the chain towers dismantled so those huge pieces of Quendiar could be removed. Like the city walls, however, the towers had been built and strengthened with the power, and only the power could disassemble them. It was far from easy. The original builders had done good work, and those wards seemed not to have weakened a hair. Reds are doing most of the work for the time being. Sisters from other Ajas come now and then, but only a few. I expect that will change soon, though. They knew the necessity of the work, however much they might resent it. No sister could like having to labor in that fashion. The Reds doing most of it certainly grumbled enough, but the order had come from Elida, and these days that resulted in foot-dragging. Elida breathed heavily, then took a long drink. She seemed to need it. Her hand gripped the goblet so hard that tendons stood out on its back. She advanced across the patterned silk carpet as if she meant to strike at Tarna. They defy me again. Again! I will have obedience, Tarna. I will have it. Write out an order, and once I sign and seal it, post it in every Aja's quarters. She stopped almost nose to nose with Tarna, her dark eyes glittering like a raven's eyes. The sitters of any Aja that fails to send its fair share of sisters to work on the chain towers will take a daily penance from Silviana until the matter is rectified. Daily! And the sitters of any Aja that sends sisters to those talks will do the same. Write it out for me to sign. Tarna drew a deep breath. Penances might work and they might not, depending on how set the sitters were. And the Aja heads, she did not think things had gone so wrong that they might refuse to accept penance at all. That would be an end to Elida for sure, perhaps an end to the tower. But posting the order publicly, not allowing the sitters a scrap to hide behind and maintain their dignity, was the wrong way to go about it. In truth, it might well be the very worst way. If I may make a suggestion, she began as delicately as she could manage. She had never been known for delicacy. You may not, Elida cut in harshly. She took another long drink, draining her goblet, and glided across the carpet to refill it. She drank too much of late. Tarna had even seen her drunk once. How is Silviana doing with the Alvear girl? She said as she poured. Egwene spends near enough half of every day in Silviana's study, Mother. She was careful to keep her tone neutral. This was the first time Elida had asked after the young woman since her capture, 9 days ago. So much. I want her tamed in the tower.
Hey, how you doing, bro?
I doubt she will be broken, Mother. Silviana will be careful of that. And then there was the girl herself. That was not for Elida's ears, though. Tarna had been shouted at more than enough. She'd learned to avoid subjects that only resulted in shouting. Advice and suggestions unoffered were no more useless than advice and suggestions untaken, and Elida almost never took either. Egwene's stubborn, but I expect she must come around soon. The girl had to. Galena, beating Tarna's block out of her, had not expended a tenth of the effort Silviana was putting into Egwene. The girl had to yield to that soon. Excellent, Elida murmured. Excellent. She looked over her shoulder, her face a mask of serenity. Her eyes still glittered, though. Put her name on the roster to attend me. In fact, have her attend me tonight. She can serve supper for Maidani and me. It will be as you command, Mother. It seemed yet another visit to the Mistress of Novices was inevitable, but no doubt Egwene would earn just as many of those if she never came near Elida. And now your reports, Tarna. Elida sat down again and crossed her legs. Replacing her barely touched goblet on the tray, Tarna took up her folder and sat in the chair Maidani had been using. The redone wards appeared to be keeping rats out of the tower, Mother. For how long was another question. She checked those wards herself every day. But ravens and crows have been seen in the tower grounds, so the wards on the walls must be...
How's your night going, Ozark?
The midday sun cast dappled light through the leafy branches of the tall trees, mostly oak and leatherleaf and sour gum, with a smattering of cottonwoods and massive pines. Apparently there had been a fierce windstorm some years back, because fallen timber, scattered about here and there but all stretched in the same direction, provided good seating with only a little hatchet work to hack away a few limbs. Sparse undergrowth allowed a good view in all directions, and not far off, a small clear stream splashed over mossy stones. It would have been a good campsite if Matt had not been intent on covering as much ground as he could every day, but it did just as well as a place to rest the horses and eat. The Demona Mountains still lay at least 300 miles to the east, and he intended to reach them in a week. Bannon said he knew a smuggler's pass, purely by hearsay, of course.
I'll be right back.
He had overheard by chance, but he knew right where to find it. They would have them inside Murundi 2 days after that. Much safer than trying to go north into Andor or south toward Ilion. In either direction, the distance to safety would be further, and the chance of encountering Seanchan greater. Matt gnawed the last scrap of meat from a rabbit's hind leg and tossed the bone onto the ground. Balding Lopin darted in, stroking at his beard in consternation, to pick it up and drop it in the pit he and Naram had made in the mulch-covered forest floor, though the pit would be dug up by animals within a half hour after their departure. Matt moved to wipe his hands on his breeches. Tuon, nibbling at a grouse leg on the other side of the low fire, gave him a very direct look, her eyebrows raised, while the fingers of her free hand wiggled at Selucia, who had ravaged half a grouse by herself. The bosomy woman did not reply, but she sniffed, loudly. Meeting Tuon's gaze, he deliberately wiped his hands on his breeches again. He could have gone over to the stream, where the Aes Sedai were washing their hands, but no one's clothing was going to be pristine by the time they reached Murundi in any case. Besides, when a woman named you Toy all the time, it was natural to take any chance to let her know you were nobody's toy. She shook her head and waggled her fingers again. This time, Selucia laughed, and Matt felt his face heat. He could imagine 2 or 3 things she might have said, none of which he would have enjoyed hearing. Setala, sitting on the end of his log, made sure he heard some of them anyway. Reaching an agreement with the one-time Aes Sedai had not shifted her attitudes a hair. She might have said men are pigs, she murmured without lifting her eyes from her embroidery hoop. Or just that you are. Her dark gray riding dress had a high neck, but she still wore her snug silver necklace with the marriage knife hanging from it. She may have said you're a mud-footed country lout with dirt in your ears and hay in your hair. Or she might have said, I think I see the direction you're going, he told her through gritted teeth. Tuan giggled, though the next instant her face belonged on an executioner once more, cold and stern. Pulling his silver-mounted pipe and goatskin tobacco pouch from his coat pocket, he thumbed the bowl full and lifted the lid on the box of strikers at his feet. It fascinated him the way fire just sprang up, spikes of it darting in all directions at first, when he scratched the lumpy red and white head of a striker down the rough side of the box. He waited until the flame burned away from the head before using it to light his pipe. Pulling the taste and smell of sulfur into his mouth once had been enough for him. He dropped the burning stick and ground it firmly under his boot. The mulch was still damp from the last rain to fall here, but he took no chances with fire in woods. In the two rivers, men turned out from miles around when the woods caught fire. Sometimes hundreds of marches burned even so. The strikers, they should not be wasted, Eludra said, lifting her eyes from the small stones board balanced atop a nearby log. Tom, stroking his long white mustaches, continued to contemplate the cross-hatched board. He rarely lost at stones, yet she had managed to win 2 games from him since they left the show. 2 out of a dozen or more, but Tom took care with anyone who could defeat him even once. She swept her beaded braids back over her shoulders. Me, I must be in the same place for 2 days to make more. Men always find ways to make work for women, yes? Matt puffed away, if not contentedly, at least with some degree of pleasure. Women, a delight to look at and a delight to be with, when they were not finding ways to rub salt into a man's hide. It seemed 6 up and a half dozen down. It truly did. Most of the party had finished eating. The best part of 2 grouse and 1 rabbit were all that remained on the spits over the fire, but they would be taken along wrapped in linen. The hunting had been good during the morning's ride, yet there was no certainty the afternoon would be as profitable, and flatbread and beans made a poor meal. Those who were finished were taking their ease, or, in the case of the Red Arms, checking the hobbled pack horses, better than 60 of them on 4 leads. Buying so many in Maturin had been expensive, but Luca had rushed into town to take care of the bargaining himself once he had heard about a merchant dead in the street. He almost, but not quite, had been ready to give them pack horses from the show's animals to be rid of Matt after that. Many of the animals were loaded with Eludra's paraphernalia and her supplies. Luca had ended up with the greater part by far of Matt's gold one way and another. Matt had slipped a fat purse to Petra and Clarine, too, but that was friendship, to help them buy their inn a little sooner. What remained in his saddlebags was more than enough to see them comfortably to Murandy, though, and all he needed to replenish it was a common room where dice were being tossed. Lylewyn, with a curved sword hanging from a broad leather strap that slanted across her chest, and Doman, with a short sword on one side of his belt and a brass-studded cudgel on the other, were chatting with Julian and Damathera on yet another log close by. Lylewyn, he had come to accept that was the only name she would stomach, made a point of showing that she would not avoid Tuan or Selucia, or lower her eyes when they met, though she had to steel herself visibly to carry it off. Julian had the cuffs of his black coat turned back, a sign he felt among friends, or at least people he could trust. The one-time Panarch of Terrebonne still clutched the thief-catcher's arm tightly, but she met Lylewyn's sharp blue eyes with little flinching. In fact, she often seemed to gaze at the other woman with something approaching awe. Seated cross-legged on the ground and unmindful of the dampness, Noel was playing snakes and foxes with Olver and spinning wild tales about the lands beyond the Aiel Waste, about some great coastal city that foreigners were not allowed to leave, except by ship, and the inhabitants were not allowed to leave at all. Matt wished they would find another game to play. Every time they brought out that piece of red cloth with its spider web of black lines, it reminded him of his promise to Tom, reminded him the bloody eel fin were inside his head somehow, and maybe the flaming ale fin too. The Aes Sedai came up from the stream, and Jolene stopped to talk with Blerick and Fen. Bethaman and Sita, trailing along behind, hesitated until a gesture from the Green sent them to stand behind the log where Teslin and Edicina sat, as far apart as they could manage, with uncut branches between, and began reading small leather-bound books taken from their belt pouches. Both Bethaman and Sita stood behind Edicina. The yellow-haired former Suldam had come round in spectacular and painful fashion. Painful for her and for the sisters. When she first hesitantly asked them to teach her too, at supper the night before, they refused. They were only teaching Bethaman because she had already channeled. Sita was too old to become a novice. She had not channeled, and that was that. So she duplicated whatever it was that Bethaman had done, and had all three leaping about the cook fire and squealing in showers of dancing sparks for as long as she could hold on to the power. They agreed to teach her then. At least Jolene and Edicina did. Teslin still was having none of any Suldam, former or not. All three of them took a hand in switching her, though, and spent the morning continually easing herself in her saddle. She still looked afraid, of the one power and maybe of the Aes Sedai, but strangely, her face somehow seemed content, too. How to understand that was beyond Matt. He should have felt content himself. He had avoided a charge of murder, avoided riding blindly into a Sean-Chan trap that would have killed Tuon, and left the Golem behind for good this time. It would be following Luca's show, and Luca had been warned for whatever good that would do. In well under 2 weeks, he would be over the mountains into Murundi. The need to figure out how to get Tuon back to Abu Dar safely, no easy task at all now, especially since he would have to guard against Aes Sedai trying to spirit her away, would mean that much longer to look at her face, and to try puzzling out what went on behind those big, beautiful eyes. He should have been as happy as a goat in a corn crib. He was far from it. For one thing, all those sword cuts he had received in Madarin hurt. Some of them were inflamed, though he had managed to keep that from anyone so far. He hated being fussed over nearly as much as he hated anyone using the power on him. Lopen and Nerim had sewed him up as well as they could, and he had refused healing despite attempted bullying by all three Aes Sedai. He had been surprised that Jolene, of all people, tried to insist, but she did, and flung up her hands in disgust when he failed to relent. Another surprise had been Tuon. "Don't be foolish, Toy," she had drawled in his tent, standing over him, arms folded beneath her breasts, while Lopen and Nerim plied their needles and he gritted his teeth. Her proprietary air, very much a woman making sure her property was repaired properly, had been enough to make him grind his teeth, never mind the needles. Or that he was down to his small clothes. She had just walked in and refused to leave short of manhandling, and he had felt in no condition to manhandle a woman he suspected might be able to break his arm. "This healing is a wonderful thing. My Mylan knows it, and I taught it to my others, too. Of course, many people are foolish about having the power touch them. Half my servants would faint at the suggestion, and most of the blood, too. I shouldn't be surprised. But I wouldn't have expected it of you." If she had a quarter his experience of Aes Sedai, she would have. They had ridden off up the road from Madarin, as if setting out for Lugard, then taken to the forest as soon as the last farms were out of sight. The moment they entered the trees, the dice started up in his head again. That was the other thing that soured his mood, those bloody dice drumming inside his head for 2 days. There hardly seemed any way they could stop here in the forest. What kind of momentous event could happen in the woods? Still, he had stayed well clear of small villages they had passed. Sooner or later the dice would stop, though, and he could only wait for it. Tuon and Selucia headed for the stream to wash, wiggling their fingers at one another rapidly. Talking about him, he was sure. When women started putting their heads together, you could be sure. Amathera screamed, and every head whipped around toward her. Matt spotted the cause as quickly as Julian did. A black-scaled snake, a good 7 feet long, wriggling quickly away from the log Julian was seated on. Lylewyn cursed and leaped to her feet, drawing her sword, but no faster than Julian, who tugged his short sword free of its scabbard and started after the snake so swiftly that his conical red cap fell off. "Let it go, Julian," Matt said. "It's heading away from us. Let it go." The thing probably had a den under that log and had been surprised to come out and find people. Luckily, black lances were solitary snakes. Julian hesitated before deciding that comforting a shivering Amathera was more important than chasing a snake. "What kind is it, anyway?" he said, folding her in his arms. He was a city man, after all. Matt told him, and for a moment he looked as though he meant to go after it again. Wisely, he decided against. Black lances were quick as lightning, and with a short sword he would have needed to get close. Anyway, Amathera was clinging to him so hard he would have had a time getting free of her. Taking his hat from the butt of his Ashandarai, which was driven point down into the ground, Matt settled it on his head. "Daylight's wasting," he said around his pipe stem. "Time we were moving on. Don't dawdle over there, Tuan. Your hands are clean enough." He had tried calling her precious, but since her claim of victory back in Matarin, she refused to acknowledge that he had even spoken when he did. She did not hurry in the slightest, of course. By the time she returned, drying her small hands on a small piece of toweling that Selucia would drape across the pommel of her saddle to dry, Naram and Lopin had filled in the refuse pit, wrapped the remains of the meal, and tucked them into Naram's saddlebags, and doused the fire with water brought from the stream in folding leather buckets. Ashandarai in hand, Matt was ready to mount Pips. "A strange man who lets poisonous serpents go," Tuan said. "From the fellow's reaction, I assume a black lance is poisonous." "Very," he told her. "But snakes don't bite anything they can't eat, unless they're threatened." He put a foot in the stirrup. "You may kiss me, toy." He gave a start. Her words, not spoken softly, had made them the object of every eye. Selucia's face was so stiffly expressionless, her disapproval could not have been plainer. "Now," he said, "when we stop tonight, we could take a stroll alone." "By tonight, I may have changed my mind, toy. Call it a whim for a man who lets poisonous snakes go." Maybe she saw one of her omens in that. Taking off his hat and sticking the black spear back into the ground, he took the pipe from between his teeth and planted a chaste kiss on her full lips. A first kiss was nothing to be rough with. He did not want her to think him pushy or crude. She was no tavern maid to enjoy a bit of slap and tickle. Besides, he could almost feel all those eyes watching. Someone snickered. Selucia rolled her eyes. Tuan folded her arms beneath her breasts and looked up at him through her long eyelashes. "Do I remind you of your sister?" she asked in a dangerous tone. "Or perhaps your mother?" Somebody laughed. More than one somebody, in fact. Grimly, Matt tapped the dottle from his pipe on the heel of his boot and stuffed the warm pipe into his coat pocket. He hung his hat back on the Ashandarai. If she wanted a real kiss, had he really thought she would not fill his arms? Slim she was, to be sure, and small, but she filled them very nicely indeed. He bent his head to hers. She was far from the first woman he had kissed. He knew what he was about. Surprisingly, or then again perhaps not so surprisingly, she did not know. She was a quick pupil, though, very quick. When he finally released her, she stood there looking up at him and trying to catch her breath. For that matter, his breath came a little raggedly, too. Metwin whistled appreciatively. Matt smiled. What would she think of what plainly was her first real kiss ever? He tried not to smile too widely, though. He did not want her to think he was smirking. She laid fingers against his cheek. "I thought so," she said in that slow honey drawl. "You're feverish. Some of your wounds must be infected." Matt blinked. He gave her a kiss that had to have curled her toes, and all she said was that his face was hot. He bent his head again. This time she would bloody well need help to stay standing. But she put a hand against his chest, fending him off. "Selucia, fetch the box of ointments I got from Mistress Luca," she commanded. Selucia went scurrying for Tuon's black and white mount. "We don't have time for that now," Matt said. "I'll smear on something tonight." He might as well have kept his mouth shut. "Strip off, toy," she said in the same tone she had used with her maid. "The ointment will sting, but I expect you to be brave." "I am not going to—" "Rider's coming," Onin announced. He was already in his saddle, on a dark bay gelding with white forefeet, holding the lead to one of the strings of pack horses. "One of them's Vannin." Matt swung up onto Pips for a better vantage. A pair of horsemen were approaching at a gallop, dodging around fallen trees when they had to. Aside from recognizing Chell Vannin's dun, there was no mistaking the man himself. Nobody else who was that wide and sat his saddle like a sack of suet could have maintained his seat at that pace without any apparent effort. The man could have stayed in a saddle on a wild boar. Then Matt recognized the other rider, whose cloak was flailing behind him, and felt as if he had been punched in the belly. He would not have been surprised in the least had the dice stopped then, but they kept bouncing off the inside of his skull. What in the light was Talmanis bloody well doing in Altara? The two riders slowed to a walk short of Matt, and Vannin reined in to let Talmanis approach alone. It was not shyness. There was nothing shy about Vannin. He leaned lazily on the tall pommel of his saddle and spat to one side through a gap in his teeth. No, he knew Matt would not be best pleased, and he meant to stay clear. "Vannin brought me up to date, Matt," Talmanis said. Short and wiry, with the front of his head shaved and powdered, the Carianan had the right to wear stripes of color across his chest in considerable number, but a small red hand sewn to the breast of his dark coat was its only decoration, unless you counted the long red scarf tied around his left arm. He never laughed and seldom smiled, but he had his reasons. "I was sorry to hear about Nalisian and the others. A good man, Nalisian. They all were." "Yes, they were," Matt said, keeping a tight rein on his temper. "I assume Egwene never came to you for help getting away from those fool Aes Sedai? But what in the bloody flaming light are you doing here?" Well, maybe he did not have such a tight rein after all. "At least tell me you haven't brought the whole bloody band 300 bloody miles into Altara with you." "Egwene is still the Amyrlin," the other man said calmly, straightening his cloak. Another red hand, larger, marked that. "You were wrong about her, Matt. She really is the Amyrlin seat. And she has those Aes Sedai by the scruff of the neck, though some of them might not know it yet. The last I saw, she and the whole lot of them were off to besiege Tar Valon. She might have it by now. They can make holes in the air like the one the Dragon Reborn made to take us near Saladar." The colors spun in Matt's head, resolving for an instant into Rand talking to some woman with gray hair and a bun atop her head. An Aes Sedai, he thought, but his anger blew the image away like mist. All that talk of the Amyrlin seat in Tar Valon attracted the sisters, of course. They heeled their horses up beside Matt and tried to take over. Well, Edicina hung back a little the way she did when Teslin or Jolene had the bit in her teeth, but the other two— "Who do you be talking about?" Teslin demanded while Jolene was still opening her mouth. "Egwene. There did be an accepted named Egwene Alvear, but she be a runaway." "Egwene Alvear is the one, Aes Sedai," Talmanis said politely. The man was always polite to Aes Sedai. "And she is no runaway. She is the Amyrlin seat, my word on it." Edicina made a sound that would have been called a squeak coming from anyone but an Aes Sedai. "Later for that," Matt muttered. Jolene opened her mouth again, angrily. Later, I said. That was not enough to stop the slender green, but Teslin laid a hand on her arm and murmured something, and that was. Jolene still glared daggers, though, promising to drag out everything she wanted to know later. The band, Talmanas? Oh, no, I only brought 3 banners of horse and 4,000 mounted crossbowmen. I left 3 banners of horse and 5 of foot, a little short of crossbows, in Murandy with orders to move north to Andor. And the masons' banner, of course. Handicap masons ready to hand if you need a bridge built or the like. Matt squeezed his eyes shut for a moment. 6 banners of horse and 5 of foot. And a banner of masons? The band had only been 2 banners, counting horse and foot, when he left them in Saladar. He wished he had back half the gold he had handed over to Luca so freely. How am I supposed to pay that many men? He demanded. I couldn't find enough dice games in a year. Well, as to that, I made a small deal with King Rodron. Finished with now, and not before time. I think he was about ready to turn on us. I will explain later. But the band's coffers hold a year's pay and more. Besides, sooner or later, the Dragon Reborn will give you estates, and grand ones. He has raised men to rule nations, so I hear, and you grew up with him. This time, he did not fight the colors as they resolved into Rand and the Aes Sedai. It was an Aes Sedai for sure. A hard woman she looked. If Rand tried to give him any titles, he would stuff them down Rand's bloody throat, is what he would do. Matt Coffin had no liking for nobles. Well, a few like Talmanas were all right, and Tuon. Never forget Tuon. And he certainly had no bloody desire to become one. That's as may be, was all he said, though. Selucia cleared her throat loudly. She and Tuon moved their horses up beside Matt, and Tuon was so straight in her mare's saddle, so cool-eyed, cold-faced, and regal that he expected Selucia to start proclaiming her titles. She did nothing of the sort. Instead, she shifted on her dime and scowled at him, eyes like blue coals in a fire, then cleared her throat again, very loudly. Ah. Tuon, Matt said, allow me to present Lord Talmanas de Lavinda of Cairhien. His family is distinguished and ancient, and he has added honors to its name. The little woman inclined her head, perhaps all of an inch. Talmanas, this is Tuon. So long as she called him Toy, she would get no titles from him. Selucia glared, eyes hotter than ever, impossible as that seemed. Talmanas blinked in surprise, though, and bowed very low in his saddle. Vannon pulled the sagging brim of his hat lower, half hiding his face. He still avoided looking directly at Matt. So, it seemed the man had already told Talmanas exactly who Tuon was. Growling under his breath, Matt leaned from the saddle to snatch his hat from the spear and pull up the Ashandarai. He clapped the hat on his head. We were ready to move on, Talmanas. Take us to where your men are waiting, and we'll see if we can have as good luck avoiding Seanchan on the way out of Altara as you had on the way in. We saw a good many Seanchan, Talmanas said, turning his bay to fall in beside Pips. Though most of the men we saw seemed to be Altaran. They have camps scattered everywhere, it seems. Luckily, we saw none of those flying creatures I have heard tell of. But there is a problem, Matt. There was a landslide. I lost my rear guard and some of the pack horses. The pass is well and truly blocked, Matt. I sent 3 men to try climbing over with the orders sending the band to Andor. One broke his neck and another his leg. Matt stopped Pip short. I'm guessing this is the same pass Vannon was talking about? Talmanas nodded, and Vannon, waiting to fall in farther back, said, Bloody right it was. Passes don't grow on trees, not in mountains like the Damonas. He was no respecter of rank. Then you'll have to find another one, Matt told him. I've heard you can find your way blindfolded at midnight. It should be easy for you. Flattery never hurt. Besides, he had heard that about the man. Bannon made a sound like he was swallowing his tongue. Find another pass, he muttered. Find another pass, the man says. You don't just go find another pass in new mountains like the Damonas. Why do you think I only knew the one? He was shaken to admit that much. Before this, he had been adamant that he had only heard of it. What are you talking about? Matt demanded, and Bannon explained, at great length for him. And Aes Sedai explained it to me once. You see, there's old mountains. They was there before the breaking, maybe on the bottom of the sea or the like. They have passes all over, broad and gentle. You can ride into those, and as long as you keep your head in your direction and have enough supplies, sooner or later you come out the other side. And then there's mountains made during the breaking. The fat man turned his head and spat copiously. Passes in those are narrow, twisty things, and sometimes they aren't really what you'd call passes at all. Ride into one of those and you can wander around till your food runs out trying to find a way to the other side. Loss of that pass is going to hurt a lot of folks who use it for what you might call untaxed goods. And men'll die before they find a new one that gets them all the way through. We go into the Damonas with that pass gone, likely we'll all die too. Them as doesn't turn back in time and hasn't gotten their heads so turned around they can't find a way back. Matt looked around at Tuon, the Aes Sedai, at Ulver. They were all depending on him to get them to safety. But his safe route out of Otara was not there anymore. Let's ride, he said. I have to think. He had to bloody think for all he was worth.
Chapter 26. As if the world were fog. Toy set a fast pace through the forest, but Tuon rode close behind him, with Selucia at her side, of course, so she could listen in on him and Talmanas. Her own thoughts interfered with eavesdropping, however. So he had grown up with the Dragon Reborn, had he? The Dragon Reborn. And he had denied knowing anything at all of the man. That was one lie of his she had failed to catch, and she was good at catching lies. In Shandar, the undetected lie might be the one that killed you, or sent you to the sail block as property. Had she known of his prevarication, she might have slapped his face, rather than allowing him to kiss her. Now that had been a shock, one she was not sure she had recovered from yet. Selucia had described being kissed by a man, but the actuality made the other woman's descriptions pale. No, she had to listen. You left Estion in charge? Toy erupted so loudly that a covey of grey doves burst from cover in the thin undergrowth with a mournful whirring sound. The man's a fool. Not too much of a fool to listen to Daerid, Talmanas replied calmly. He did not seem a man to get overly excited. He kept a careful watch, head swiveling constantly. Ever so often he scanned the sky through the thick branches overhead, too. He had only heard of Rakan, yet he watched for them. His words were even crisper and quicker than Toy's, and difficult to follow. These people all spoke so fast. Carloman and Ryman are not fools, Matt. At least Ryman is only a fool sometimes. But neither will they listen to a commoner, no matter how much more he knows about warfare than they do. Edorian will, but I wanted him with me. That red hand symbol Talmanas wore was intriguing. More than intriguing, much more. Of an old and distinguished house, was he? But Toy was the one. He remembered Hawkwing's face. That seemed utterly impossible, yet his denial of it had plainly been a lie, as plain as the spots on a leopard. Could the red hand be Toy's sigil? But if so, what about his ring? She'd almost fainted when she first saw that. Well, she had come as close to it as she had since childhood. That's going to change, Talmanas, Toy growled. I let it go on too long as it is. If Ryman and the others command banners now, that makes them banner generals, and you a lieutenant general. Daerid commands 5 banners, and that makes him a lieutenant general too. Ryman and the others will obey his orders or they can go home. Come Tarman Gaiden, I'm not going to have my skull split open because they bloody refuse to listen to somebody who doesn't have bloody estates. Talmanis turned his horse to ride around a patch of briars, and everyone followed. The tangled vines seemed to have particularly long thorns, and hooked besides. They will not like it, Matt, but they will not go home either. You know that. Have you any ideas yet how we are to get out of Altara? I'm thinking on it, Toy muttered. I'm thinking on it. Those crossbowmen, he exhaled heavily. That wasn't wise, Talmanis. For one thing, they're used to marching on their own feet. Half of them will have all they can do to stay in the saddle if we're moving fast, and we're going to have to. They can be useful in woods like these or anywhere they have plenty of cover, but if we're on open ground with no pikes, they'll be ridden down before they can loose a second flight. In the distance, a lion coughed. In the distance. But it was still enough to make the horses whicker nervously and dance a few steps. Toy leaned forward on his gelding's neck and appeared to whisper in the animal's ear. It quieted immediately. So that had not been another of his fanciful tales after all. Remarkable. I picked men who could ride, Matt, Talmanis said once his bay stopped frisking. And they all have the new crank. A touch of excitement entered his voice now. Even restrained men tended to warmth over weapons. 3 turns of the crank. His hands moved in a quick circle, demonstrating. And the bowstring is latched. With a little training, a man can get off 7 or 8 quarrels in a minute, with a heavy crossbow. Selucia made a small sound in her throat. She was right to be startled. If Talmanis was telling the truth, and he had no reason to lie that Tuon could find, then she had to obtain one of these marvelous cranks somehow. With one for a pattern, artisans could make more. Archers could shoot faster than crossbowmen, but they took longer to train, too. There were always more crossbowmen than archers. 7? Toy exclaimed incredulously. That would be more than useful, but I never heard of such a thing. Ever. He muttered that as if it had some special significance, then shook his head. How did you come by it? 7 or 8. There was a mechanic in Murandy who wanted to take a wagon load of things he had invented up to Camelin. There is a school of some sort there for scholars and inventors. He needed money for the journey, and he was willing to teach the band's armorers to make the things. Smother your enemy with arrows at every opportunity. It is always better to kill your enemies far off than close at hand. Selucia held her hands up so Tuon could see them, slim fingers moving quickly. What is this band they speak of? She used the proper form, inferior to superior, yet her impatience was almost palpable. Impatience with everything that was happening. Tuon kept few secrets from her, but some seemed advisable for the present. She would not put it past Selucia to return her to Ebou Dar forcibly, so she would not be breaking her word. A shadow's duties were many, and sometimes required paying the final sacrifice. She did not want to have to order Selucia's execution. She replied in the imperative form. Toy's personal army, obviously. Listen, and we may learn more. Toy commanding an army seemed very odd. He was charming at times, even witty and amusing, but often a buffoon and always a rapscallion. He had seemed very much in his element as Tylan's pet. Yet he had seemed in his element among the show's performers, too, and with the Maroth Damani and the 2 escaped Damani, and in the Hell. That had been such a disappointment. Not even one fight. Events later had not compensated for that. Getting swept up in a street brawl was hardly the same as seeing fights in a hell, which admittedly had been far more boring than rumor heard in Ebou Dar had made it seem. Toy had displayed an unexpected side of himself in that street brawl, a formidable man, though with a peculiar weakness. For some reason she found that strangely endearing. Good advice, he said absently, tugging at the black scarf tied around his neck. She wondered about the scar he took such pains to hide. That he did was understandable. Why had he been hanged, and how had he survived? She could not ask. She did not mind lowering his eyes a little. In fact, it was enjoyable making him writhe. It took so little effort. But she did not want to destroy him. At least, not for the moment. Do you not recognize it? Talmanis said. It is from your book. King Roedran has 2 copies in his library. He has it memorized. The man thinks it will make him a great captain. He was so pleased with how our bargain worked out that he had a copy printed and bound for me. Toy gave the other man a mystified look. My book? The one you told us about, Nat. Fog and Steel, by Madoc Comadrin. Oh, that book. Toy shrugged. I read it a long time ago. Tuon gritted her teeth. Her fingers flashed. When will they stop talking of books and go back to interesting things? Perhaps if we listen we may learn more, Selucia replied. Tuon glared at her, but the woman wore such an innocent look that she could not maintain her scowl. She laughed, softly, so as not to let Toy realize how close behind him she was, and Selucia joined in, softly. Toy had fallen silent, though, and Talmana seemed content to leave it so. They rode in silence, save for the sounds of the forest, birds singing, strange black-tailed squirrels chittering on branches. Tuon set herself to watching for omens, but nothing caught her eye. Bright-feathered birds darted among the trees. Once they spotted a herd of perhaps 50 tall, lean cattle with very long horns that stuck out almost straight to either side. The animals had heard them coming and were squared up, facing them. A bull tossed his head and pawed at the ground. Toy and Talmanis led the careful way around the herd, keeping their distance. She looked over her shoulder. The Red Arms. Why were they called that? She would have to ask Toy. The Red Arms were leading the pack horses, but Gordoran had raised his crossbow and the others had arrows knocked to their bows. So these cattle were dangerous. There were few omens concerning cattle, and she was relieved when the herd dwindled behind them. She had not come all this way to be killed by a cow, or to see Toy killed by one. After a time, Tom and Aludra came up to ride beside her. The woman glanced at her once, then looked straight ahead. The Taraboner's face, framed by those brightly beaded braids, was always wooden when she looked at her or Selucia. So clearly she was one of those who refused to accept the return. She was watching Toy, and she looked satisfied, as if something had been confirmed for her, perhaps. Why had Toy brought her along? Surely not for her fireworks. Those were pretty enough, but they could not compare with skylights performed by even a half-trained Damani. Tom Maryland was much more interesting. Patently, the white-haired old man was an experienced spy. Who had sent him to Abu Dar? The White Tower seemed the most obvious candidate. He spent little time around the three who called themselves Aes Sedai, but a well-trained spy would not give himself away in that fashion. His presence troubled her. Until the last Aes Sedai was leashed, the White Tower was something to be wary of. Despite everything, she still had troubling thoughts at times that somehow Toy was part of a White Tower plot. That was impossible, unless some of the Aes Sedai were omniscient, yet the thought sometimes came to her. A strange coincidence, wouldn't you say, Master Marilyn? She said. Encountering part of Toy's army in the middle of an Altaran forest. He stroked his long mustaches with a knuckle, failing to mask a small smile. He's ta'veren, my lady. And you can never tell what will happen around a ta'veren. It's always interesting when you travel with one of those. Matt has a tendency to find what he needs when he needs it. Sometimes before he knows he needs it. She stared at him, but he seemed serious. He's tied to the pattern? That was how the word would translate. What is that supposed to mean? The old man's blue eyes widened in astonishment. You don't know? But it said Arthur Hawkwing was the strongest ta'veren anyone had ever seen, perhaps as strong as Randall Thor. I'd have thought you, of all people, would... Well, if you don't, you don't. ta'veren are people the pattern shapes itself around, people who were spun out by the pattern itself to maintain the proper course of the weaving, perhaps to correct flaws that were creeping in. One of the Aes Sedai could explain better than I. As if she would have conversation with a Marath Damani. Or worse, a runaway Damani. Thank you, she told him politely. I think I've heard enough. Taviran. Ridiculous. These people and their endless superstitions. A small brown bird, surely a finch, flew out of a tall oak and circled Widdershins 3 times above Toy's head before flying on. She had found her omen. Stay close to Toy. Not that she had any intention of doing otherwise. She had given her word, playing the game as it had to be played, and she had never broken her word in her life. Little more than an hour after setting out, as a bird warbled ahead, Selusha pointed out the first sentry, a man with a crossbow up in the thick branches of a spreading oak, cupping a hand to his mouth. Not a bird, then. More bird calls heralded their advance, and soon they were riding through a tidy encampment. There were no tents, but the lances were neatly stacked, the horses picketed on scattered lines among the trees, near to the blankets of the men who would ride them, with a saddle or pack saddle at every animal's head. It would not take long for them to break camp and be on the march. Their fires were small and gave off little smoke. As they rode in, men in dull green breastplates with that red hand on their coat sleeves and red scarves tied to their left arms began rising to their feet. She saw grizzled faces with scars and fresh young faces, all with their eyes on Toy and expressions she could only call eager. A growing murmur of voices rose, rustling through the trees like a breeze. It's Lord Matt. Lord Matt is back. Lord Matt's found us. Lord Matt. Tuon exchanged glances with Selusha. The affection in those voices was unfeigned. That was rare, and often went with a commander who had a slack hand at discipline. But then she expected any army of toys to be a ragtag affair, full of men who spent their time drinking and gambling. Only these men looked no more ragtag than any regiment that had crossed a mountain range and ridden several hundred miles. No one looked unsteady on his feet with drink. Mostly we camp during the day and move at night to avoid being seen by the Shonshan, Talmanas said to Toy. Just because we have seen none of those flying beasts does not mean some might not be around. Most of the Shonshan seem to be farther north or farther south, but apparently they have a camp not 30 miles north of here, and rumor says there is one of the creatures there. You seem pretty well informed, Toy said, studying the soldiers they passed. He nodded suddenly, as if he had reached a decision. He seemed grim, and could it be resigned? I am that, Matt. I brought half the scouts, and I also signed some Altarans who were fighting the Shonshan. Well, most of them seem to have been stealing horses more than anything else, but some were willing to give that up for a chance to really fight them. I think I know where most of the Shonshan camps are, from the Malvide Narrows south to here. Suddenly a man began to sing in a deep voice, and others joined in, the song spreading rapidly. There's some delight in ale and wine, and some in girls with ankles fine. But my delight, yes, always mine, is to dance with Jack of the Shadows. Every man in the camp was singing now, thousands of voices roaring the song. We'll toss the dice however they fall, and snuggle the girls be they short or tall, then follow Lord Matt whenever he calls, to dance with Jack of the Shadows. They finished with shouts, laughing and clapping one another on the shoulder. Who under the light was this Jack of the Shadows? Reining in, Toy raised the hand holding his odd spear. That was all, yet silence spread through the soldiers. So he was not soft with discipline. There were a few other reasons for soldiers to be fond of their officers, but the most common seemed unlikely to apply to Toy of all people. Let's not let them know we're here until we want them to know, Toy said loudly. He was not orating, just making sure his voice carried. And the men heard, repeating his words over their shoulders to be passed back to men beyond the sound of his voice. We're a long way from home, but I mean to get us home. So be ready to move, and move fast. The Band of the Red Hand can move faster than anybody else, and we're going to have to prove it. There was no cheering, but plenty of nods. Turning to Talmanas, he said, Do you have maps? The best to be found, Talmanas replied. The band has its own map maker now. Master Roydell already had good maps of everything from the Arth Ocean to the spine of the world, and since we crossed the Damonas, he and his assistants have been making new maps of the country we crossed. They even marked a map of eastern Altara with what we have learned of the Shanshan. Most of those camps are temporary, though. Soldiers heading somewhere else. Selusha shifted in her saddle, and Tuon signed patience in high imperative form, a command. She kept her face smooth, but inside she was furious. Knowing where soldiers were gave clues to where they were going. There had to be some way to burn that map. That would be as important as laying hands on one of the crossbow cranks. I'll want to talk with Master Roydell, too, Toy said. Soldiers came to take the horses, and for a while all seemed confusion and milling about. A gap-toothed fellow took Ake'in's reins, and Tuon gave him explicit instructions on caring for the mare. He returned her a sour look along with his bow. Commoners in these lands seemed to believe themselves equal to everyone. Selusha gave the same sort of instructions to the lanky young man who took Rosebud. She thought that an appropriate name for a dresser's horse. The young man stared at Selusha's chest until she slapped him hard. He only grinned and led the dun away, rubbing his cheek. Tuon sighed. That was all very well for Selusha, but for herself, striking a commoner would lower her eyes for months. Soon enough, though, she was settled on a folding stool with Selusha at her back, and stout Lopen presented them with tin cups full of dark tea, bowing quite properly to Selusha as well as to her. Not deeply enough, but the balding man did try. Her tea was honeyed to perfection, lightly, but then he had served her often enough to know how she liked it. Activity bustled about them. Talmanas had a brief reunion with gray-haired Naren, who apparently was his serving man, and happy to be reunited with him. At least the thin man's normally mournful countenance actually flashed a momentary smile. That sort of thing should have been done in private. Lylwyn and Doman allowed Master Charon to lead Ulver off to explore the camp with Juilin and Thera. Tom and Aludra went too, to stretch their legs, then deliberately took stools close by. Lylwyn even went so far as to stare unblinking at Tuon for a long moment. Selusha made a low sound, very like a growl, but Tuon ignored the provocation and gestured Mistress Anand to bring her stool over beside her. Eventually the traitors would be punished, and the thief, the property restored to its rightful owners, and the Marath Damani leashed. But those things had to wait on what was more important. 3 more officers appeared, young noblemen with that red hand on their dark silk coats, and had their own reunion with Toy, with a great deal of laughing and hitting each other on the shoulder, which they seemed to take as a sign of fondness. She soon had them sorted out. Adorian was the dark, lean man with the serious expression, except when smiling. Ryman, the broad-shouldered fellow who smiled a great deal, and Carloman, the tall, slender one. Adorian was clean-shaven, while Ryman and Carloman both had dark beards that were trimmed to points and glistened as if oiled. All 3 made much over the Aes Sedai, bowing deeply. They even bowed to Bethamin and Sita. Tuon shook her head. I've told you often enough it's a different world than you're used to, Mistress Anand murmured. But you still don't quite believe it, do you? Just because a thing is a certain way, Tuon replied, doesn't mean it should be that way, even if it has been for a long time. Some might say the same of your people, my lady. Some might. Tuon let it rest there, though she usually enjoyed her private conversations with the woman. Mistress Anand argued against leashing Marath Damani, as might be expected, and even against keeping Dako Vale of all things. Yet they were discussions rather than arguments, and Tuon had made her concede a few points. She had hopes of bringing the woman around eventually. Not today, though. She wanted her mind focused on Toy. Master Roydell appeared, a graying, round-faced man whose bulk strained his dark coat, followed by 6 fit-appearing younger men, each carrying a long cylindrical leather case. I brought all the maps of Altara I have, my lord, he told Talmanas in a musical accent as he bowed. Did everyone in these lands speak as if racing to get the words out? Some cover the whole country, they do, some no more than 100 square miles. The best are my own, of course, those I made these past weeks. Lord Matt will tell you what he wants to see, Talmanas said. Shall we leave you to it, Matt? But Toy was already telling the map maker what he wanted. The map marked with the Shongshan camps. In short order, it was sorted out from the others in one of the cases and spread on the ground, with Toy squatting on his heels beside it. Master Roydell sent one of his assistants running to fetch him a stool. He would have burst his coat buttons trying to imitate Toy, and likely have fallen over besides. Tuon stared at that map hungrily. How to get her hands on it? Exchanging glances and laughing as if being snubbed were the funniest thing in the world, Talmanas and the other three men strolled toward Tuon. The Aes Sedai gathered around the map on the ground until Toy told them to quit peering over his shoulder. They moved off a little, Bethamin and Sita heeling them at a distance, and began talking quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing in his direction. If Toy had been paying any heed to their expressions, especially Jolene's, he might have been worried in spite of the incredible ter'angreal Mistress Anand said he carried. "We're about here, right?" he said, marking a spot with his finger. Master Roydell murmured that they were. "So this is the camp where the Rakan supposedly is? The flying beast?" Another murmur of assent. "Good. What kind of camp is it? How many men are there?" "Reportedly it's a supply camp, my lord, for resupplying patrols." The young man returned with another folding stool, and the stout man eased himself down with a grunt. "Supposedly about 100 soldiers, mostly Altaran, and about 200 laborers, but I'm told there can be as many as 500 more soldiers at times. A careful man, Master Roydell." Talmanas made one of those odd bows with one foot forward, and the other three mirrored him. "My lady," Talmanas said, "Vanin told me of your circumstances and the promises Lord Matt made. I just want to tell you he keeps his word." "That he does, my lady," Adorian murmured. "Always." Tuon motioned him to step aside so she could continue to watch Toy, and he did so with a surprised glance at Toy and another for her. She gave him a stern look. The last thing she wanted was for these men to start imagining things. Not everything had fallen out as it had to yet. There was still a chance this could all go awry. "Is he a lord or is he not?" she demanded. "Excuse me," Talmanas said, "but would you say that again? I apologize. I must have dirt in my ears." She repeated herself carefully, but it still took them a minute to puzzle out what she had said. "Burn my soul, no," Ryman said finally with a laugh. He stroked his beard. "Except to us. Lord enough for us." "He dislikes nobles for the most part," Carloman said. "I count it an honor to be among the few he doesn't dislike." "An honor," Ryman agreed. Adorian contented himself with nodding. "Soldiers, Master Roydell," Toy said firmly. "Show me where the soldiers are, and more than any few hundred." "What is he doing?" Tuon said, frowning.
Yeah, pretty
"He
much.
can't keep a seat, this
I
young
just
man out of
pretty
Altara,
much kick back,
even if he
listen
knows
to
where
an
every last
audiobook
soldier is.
before I
There
go
are
to
always
bed and
patrols
smoke a
and
little
sweeps
bit.
by Rakan." Again, they took their time before answering. Perhaps she should try speaking very fast. "We've seen no patrols in better than 300 miles, and no..." "Rakan?" "No, Rakan," Adorian said quietly. He was studying her. Too late to stop his imaginings. Ryman laughed again. "If I know Matt, he's planning us a battle. The Band of the Red Hand rides to battle again. It's been too long, if you ask me." Selucia sniffed, and so did Mistress Anand. Tuon had to agree with them. "A battle won't get you out of Altara," she said sharply. "In that case," Talmanas said, "he's planning us a war." The other three nodded agreement as if that were the most normal thing under the light. Ryman even laughed. He seemed to think everything was humorous. 3,000? Toy said. "You're sure?" "Sure enough, man. Sure enough will do. Vanin can locate them if they haven't moved too far." Tuon looked at him, squatting there by the map, moving his fingers over its surface, and suddenly she saw him in a new light. A buffoon? No. A lion stuffed into a horse stall might look like a peculiar joke, but a lion on the high plains was something very different. Toy was loose on the high plains now. She felt a chill. What sort of man had she entangled herself in? After all this time, she realized, she had hardly a clue.
The night was cool enough to send a small shiver through Perrin whenever the breeze gusted despite his fur-lined cloak. A halo around the fat crescent moon said there would be more rain before long. Thick clouds drifting across the moon made the pale light dim and strengthen, yet it was enough for his eyes. He sat stepper just inside the edge of the trees and watched the cluster of 4 tall gray-stone windmills in a clearing atop the ridge, their pale sails gleaming and shadowed by turns as they rotated. The machinery of the windmills groaned loudly. It seemed doubtful the Shido even knew they should grease the works of the things. The stone aqueduct was a dark bar stretching east of high stone arches, past abandoned farms and rail-fenced fields the Shido had planted too early with this much rain, toward another ridge and the lake beyond. Malden lay one more ridge west. He eased the heavy hammer in its loop on his belt. Malden and Fail. In a few hours, he would add a 54th knot to the leather cord in his pocket. He cast his mind out. Are you ready, Snowy Dawn? He thought. Are you close enough yet? Wolves avoided towns. Shido hunting parties in the surrounding forest during the day, they stayed further from Malden than usual. Patience, young bull, came the reply, touched with irritation. But then Snowy Dawn was irascible by nature, a scarred male of considerable age for a wolf who had once killed a leopard by himself. Those old injuries sometimes kept him from sleeping very long at a stretch. 2 days from now, you said. We will be there. Now let me try to sleep. We must hunt well tomorrow, since we cannot hunt the day after. They were images and smells, rather than words, of course. 2 days was the sun crossing the sky twice. Hunt, a pack trotting with noses into the breeze, blended with the scent of deer. But Perrin's mind converted the images to words even as he saw them in his head. Patience, yes. Haste spoiled the work. But it was hard now that he was so close, very hard. A form appeared from the dark door at the base of the nearest windmill and waved an ideal spear back and forth overhead. The groaning had convinced him the windmills must still be deserted. They had been when the maidens scouted them earlier, and no one would put up with that noise any longer than they had to. But he had sent Gaul and some of the maidens to be sure one way or another. Let's go, Mishima, he said, gathering his reins. It's done. One way or another. How can you make out anything? Chan muttered, looking at Perrin, whose golden eyes would be glowing in the night. That had made the scarred man jump the first time he saw it. He did not smell amused tonight. He smelled tense. But he called softly over his shoulder. Bring the carts ahead. Quickly now. Quickly. And be quiet about it, or I'll have your ears. Perrin heeled his dun stallion forward without waiting on the others, or the 6 high-wheeled carts. Liberally greased axles made them as quiet as carts could be. They still sounded noisy to him, the cart horses' hooves squelching in the mud, the carts themselves creaking as wood flexed and rubbed, but he doubted anyone else could have heard them 50 paces off, and maybe not closer. At the top of the gentle slope, he dismounted, let Stepper's reins fall. A trained warhorse, the stallion would stand there, as if hobbled so long as his reins hung down. The windmill heads squealed, turning slightly as the breeze shifted. The slowly spinning arms were long enough that Perrin could have touched one by jumping when it swung low. He stared toward the last ridge that hid Malden. Nothing grew there taller than a bush. Nothing moved in the darkness. Just one ridge between him and Fail. The maidens had come outside to join Gaul, all of them still veiled. There was no one, Gaul said, not quietly. This close, the grinding of the windmill's gears would have swallowed quiet words. The dust has not been disturbed since I was here last, Sulin added. Perrin scratched his beard, just as well. Had they needed to kill Shido, they could have carried away the bodies, but the dead would have been missed, and it would have drawn attention to the windmills and aqueduct. It might have started someone thinking about the water. Help me get the lids off, Gaul. There was no need for him to do that. It would save only minutes, but he needed to be doing something. Gaul simply stuck his spear through the harness holding his bow case to join the others on his back. The aqueduct ran along the ground on the ridgetop between the 4 windmills and stood shoulder high on Perrin, less on Gaul, who climbed over. Just beyond the last pair of windmills, bronze handles on and stood shoulder high on Perrin, less on Gaul, who climbed over. Just beyond the last pair of windmills, bronze handles on either side allowed them to lift off heavy pieces of stone 2 feet wide and 5 feet long until they cleared a stretch of 6 feet. What the opening was used for, he did not know. There was another like it on the other side, maybe to work on the flaps that made sure water flowed only one way, or to get inside to repair any leaks. He could see small ripples of motion as it streamed toward Malden, filling more than half the stone channel. Mishima joined them and dismounted to stand peering uncertainly at Sulan and the maidens. He probably believed the night hid his expression. He smelled wary now. He was followed quickly by the first of the red-coated Shongshan soldiers, scrambling up the muddy slope, each carrying 2 middling-sized jute sacks. Middling, but not heavy. Each contained only 10 pounds. Eyeing the Aiel suspiciously, the wiry woman set her sacks down and slashed one open with her dagger. A handful of fine, dark grains spilled on the muddy ground. "Do that over the opening," Perrin said. "Make sure every grain goes into the water." The wiry woman looked to Mishima, who said firmly, "Do as Lord Perrin commands, Arata." Perrin watched as she emptied the sack into the aqueduct, hands lifted over her head. The dark grains floated away toward Malden. He had dropped a pinch into a cup of water, hating to waste even that, and they took some time to absorb enough water to sink, long enough to reach the big cistern in the town, he hoped. And if not, they could steep in the aqueduct itself. The cistern would still turn to forkroot tea eventually. The light said it would be strong enough. With luck, maybe even strong enough to affect the Algaid Siswai, the wise ones who could channel.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.